Hey everyone, welcome to Midnight Truth. I know a lot of you listen to these stories to help you find a peaceful sleep. So before you start, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked slower than it should have. At least that's what Lena thought. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination or if the clock really skipped a beat every few seconds. Tick, tick, nothing. Tick. The silence between those ticks felt like a breath held too long, heavy and unnatural, and it was starting to mess with her nerves. She stared at it, the golden pendulum swinging back and forth, and for a brief moment she thought it stopped mid-air. "It's just a clock," she whispered to herself, running a hand through her hair. The room was quiet, too quiet. Lena glanced at her phone. Midnight. She had sworn she wouldn't stay this late, not after what she'd heard about the house. But a dare was a dare. And Lena never backed down from a dare. Her friends had teased her earlier that evening. "Come on, Lena. Just one night," Mia had said, her voice dripping with mock sincerity. "You're not scared, are you? Of an old, empty house?" "Please," Lena had scoffed. But now, sitting alone in the dimly lit living room of the old Whitefield mansion, she wasn't so sure. The stories about this place weren't just silly rumors passed around school. People had gone missing here. Strange things happened, things no one could explain. The first sign of trouble came hours ago when she tried to switch on the lights and the power failed. That wasn't entirely unexpected in an old house, but it set the tone for the evening. Now, with only her flashlight and the dying embers of the fireplace for light, every shadow seemed alive, every creak of the wooden floor a whisper of something unseen. Lena's hand tightened around the flashlight as she scanned the room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, like ghosts frozen mid-dance. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else, a metallic tang she couldn't quite place. Then she heard it, a faint shuffle from upstairs. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's probably just the wind," she muttered, trying to convince herself, but deep down she knew better. The sound had weight to it, like footsteps, deliberate and slow. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She stood up, her knees wobbling slightly, and pointed the flashlight toward the staircase. The beam of light barely reached the top of the stairs, leaving the upper floor shrouded in darkness. She considered calling Mia or any of her other friends, but she knew they'd laugh at her. "You're really scared of an empty house?" they'd say. No way was she giving them that satisfaction. Taking a deep breath, she started up the stairs, the old wooden steps groaning under her weight. Halfway up she stopped. The shuffle came again, louder this time, directly above her. Her heart pounded as she gripped the flashlight tighter, her fingers slick with sweat. She was at the top now, facing a long, narrow hallway with doors lining both sides. The air here was colder, and she swore she could hear faint breathing, though she couldn't tell where it was coming from. She approached the first door, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Slowly, she turned the handle and pushed it open. The room was empty. A sigh of relief escaped her lips, but it was short-lived. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. She swung the flashlight back toward the room and froze. There, in the corner, was a small mirror leaning against the wall. In its reflection, she saw herself, and someone standing behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but the hallway was empty. Her breathing grew ragged as she stepped back into the hallway. The mirror hadn't been there when she first walked up. She was sure of it. Another shuffle, this time from the room at the far end of the hall. Lena's stomach churned, but she forced herself to move forward. She had to prove to herself that it was nothing, that her mind was playing tricks on her. The door to the last room was slightly ajar, and as she approached, she noticed a faint red light spilling out from the gap. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. No response. She pushed the door open with her foot, her flashlight scanning the room. It was empty, save for a single object in the center. A small wooden box, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under the flashlight's beam. Lena hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but something about the box drew her in. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the cool wood. The moment she touched it, the door slammed shut behind her. Lena's scream was swallowed by the deafening silence that followed the door's violent slam. She spun around, her flashlight jerking wildly, but the room was now sealed tight. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as she pressed her hand against the door, trying to force it open. It didn't budge. She was trapped. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the walls were closing in. Lena turned back to the small wooden box in the center of the floor. Its strange, writhing symbols seemed alive, glowing faintly with an eerie red hue. A low hum began to fill the room, vibrating through the floor and into her chest. It wasn't coming from the box. It was all around her. Lena's ears popped as the sound grew louder, more oppressive. She stumbled backward, clutching her head. "Stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. The hum stopped. For a moment the room was still. Too still. Even her own breathing seemed muted. Then a faint whisper broke the silence. "Lena." Her name, spoken so softly it was almost inaudible, sent chills racing down her spine. She whipped around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. No answer. She turned back to the box, her curiosity warring with her fear. She knew she should leave it alone, but something about it seemed personal, like it was meant for her. Against her better judgment, she knelt down again, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the lid. The symbols glowed brighter as if responding to her touch. Slowly she lifted the lid. Inside was a single object, an old, tarnished key. The moment she touched it, the room erupted in chaos. The walls shuddered, the hum returning with a vengeance, louder and more menacing. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, stretching and twisting toward her. Lena scrambled to her feet, clutching the key. The door to the room burst open with a violent force, slamming against the wall. Without thinking, she bolted. She raced down the hallway, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. The shadows were following her now, creeping along the walls and floor, faster than they had any right to move. "Let me out," she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. She reached the top of the staircase and froze. At the bottom stood a figure, tall and unmoving. It was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured, but she could feel its gaze, cold, piercing, and utterly inhuman. Lena took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of a step. She stumbled but caught herself before she fell. The figure didn't move, but the shadows behind her did, slithering closer like a living tide. With no other choice, she turned and ran back down the hallway. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. The windows were boarded up, the doors locked. The hum grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made her skin crawl. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the shadows rising, forming shapes, hands, faces, impossible, distorted things that reached for her. She ducked into the first room she saw, slamming the door shut and pressing her back against it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled with the key in her hand. "What are you for?" she whispered, staring at the tarnished metal. The growl outside the door grew louder, more insistent. The wood splintered as something heavy slammed against it. Desperate, Lena scanned the room. Her flashlight landed on a small door in the far corner, half hidden behind a dusty dresser. It was barely large enough for her to crawl through. She didn't hesitate. She shoved the dresser aside, her muscles screaming in protest, and scrambled through the tiny door. On the other side was a narrow passageway, the walls rough and uneven, carved from stone. The air was damp and smelled of earth and decay. The growling continued behind her, now accompanied by the sound of splintering wood. Whatever was out there, it was coming. Lena crawled as fast as she could, her knees scraping against the cold stone. The passage twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the unknown. The sound of her own breathing echoed around her, mingling with the faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Lena." Her name again, this time louder. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice bouncing off the stone. No response. The passage ended abruptly, opening into a cavernous room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars of varying sizes. Some contained strange, murky liquids. Others held things she couldn't identify, shapes that twisted and moved when she looked at them too long. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat another box, identical to the one upstairs. Lena's pulse quickened. She didn't want to open it, but she felt compelled to, as if some unseen force was guiding her. She approached the table, her hands trembling as she reached for the box. This time the lid opened on its own. Inside was a piece of paper, yellowed with age. Written on it, in neat, precise handwriting, were two words: "Find him." A sudden roar echoed through the cavern, and Lena spun around. The passage she had come through was gone, replaced by solid stone. The room began to shake, the jars rattling on their shelves. Shadows poured in from the walls, coalescing into a shape, a figure, tall and imposing, with eyes that burned like embers. "Who are you?" Lena demanded, backing away. The figure stepped closer, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You took the key," it said. The figure loomed over her, its ember-like eyes piercing through the darkness. Lena clutched the key tighter, her mind racing as she backed further into the room. The shaking walls, the jars trembling on the shelves, and the creature's guttural voice all blended into a cacophony of terror. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice barely steady. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it raised a long shadowy arm and pointed at the key in her hand. Its voice reverberated through the air like a low growl. "You've opened the path," it said. "Now you must finish what you started." "What path? What are you talking about?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, the shadows around it writhing like a living thing. Lena's instincts screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The passage was gone, the walls around her solid and unyielding. As the creature moved closer, its presence became suffocating. The air grew colder, biting at her skin, and the faint whisper she'd heard earlier returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't coming from the walls anymore, they were coming from the key. Lena looked down at the tarnished metal in her hand. It felt warm now, almost burning against her palm. The whispers grew louder, forming words she could barely make out. "Use it, unlock the door, before it's too late." "What door?" she hissed, frustration and fear mixing in her voice. The figure stopped just a few feet away from her, its form towering and distorted, as if it didn't belong in this world. Its ember-like eyes flared brighter, and it raised its arm again, this time pointing toward the far corner of the room. Lena followed its gaze and saw it, a door hidden in the shadows, its surface made of the same dark wood as the box upstairs. Strange symbols covered its surface, glowing faintly like the ones on the box. She hesitated, her heart pounding. Everything in her screamed that she shouldn't go near it, but the whispers in the key grew more urgent, almost desperate. "Unlock it." Lena took a shaky step toward the door. The figure didn't move to stop her, but its presence felt heavier, pressing down on her like a weight. She reached the door, her fingers trembling as she raised the key. The moment the key touched the lock, the whispers stopped. Silence fell over the room, so absolute it felt deafening. Lena hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Then, with a deep breath, she turned the key. The lock clicked. The door swung open on its own, revealing a staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. A faint red glow emanated from below, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. "Go," the figure commanded, its voice rumbling like distant thunder. Lena turned to face it, her fear giving way to anger. "Why should I? What's down there?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, its form melting into the shadows that surrounded it. As it disappeared, its final words echoed through the room. "Your answers, your fate?" And then it was gone. Lena stood there, staring at the empty space where the figure had been. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and a gnawing curiosity she couldn't suppress. The staircase beckoned, the red glow pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. She took a deep breath and stepped through the doorway. The air grew colder with each step she took, and the faint metallic tang she'd noticed earlier became stronger. It clung to the back of her throat, making her stomach churn. The walls were damp, the stone slick under her fingers as she used them to steady herself. The staircase seemed endless, spiraling downward into the earth. The red glow grew brighter, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. As she descended, she began to hear something, a low, rhythmic thumping like the beating of a giant heart. It grew louder with each step, vibrating through the stone and into her bones. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound. Finally, the staircase ended, opening into a vast underground chamber. Lena froze at the sight before her. The room was enormous, its walls lined with ancient carvings that seemed to move and shift when she looked at them. In the center of the room was a massive altar, its surface slick with a dark, viscous substance that glistened in the red light. Above the altar hung a massive chain, its links rusted and ancient, disappearing into the darkness above. And at the base of the altar was a figure, a man shackled and kneeling, his head bowed. Lena's heart raced as she approached cautiously. The man didn't move, his breathing shallow and labored. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and gaunt. "Hey," she called out softly. "Are you okay?" The man's head lifted slowly and Lena gasped. His eyes were black pits, empty and endless, and his face was lined with scars that glowed faintly in the red light. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't exactly have a choice," Lena replied, glancing around the room. "What is this place? What's going on?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze fell on the key in her hand. His expression twisted into one of fear and anger. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" You unlocked the door, he interrupted, his voice rising. You set it free. Set what free? The man didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to something behind her, and his face contorted in terror. Lena turned slowly, her blood running cold. The shadows that had followed her were here, swirling and writhing, taking shape. They rose from the ground, forming a figure much like the one she'd seen upstairs, but this one was larger, more menacing. Its ember-like eyes burned brighter, and its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. You shouldn't have come, the man whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing roar of the shadows. Lena took a step back, her mind racing. She had to get out of here, but there was no way back. The staircase had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall of stone. The figure in the shadows stepped closer, its voice echoing through the chamber. You brought the key, it said. And now you will pay the price. Lena gripped the key tighter, her fear giving way to anger. What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its arm, and the chains above the altar began to rattle. The man shackled to the altar cried out, his body convulsing as the chains tightened around him. Stop it! Lena shouted, rushing forward. The shadows blocked her path, their cold, inky tendrils wrapping around her arms and legs. She struggled, but they held her fast, dragging her toward the altar. The man's cries grew louder, his body contorting as the chains pulled him upward. The red light in the room pulsed wildly, and the carvings on the walls began to glow. You have to stop it, the man shouted, his voice strained. The key, use the key. Lena looked down at the object in her hand, its surface now glowing hot. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent. Unlock the truth, free him. Without thinking, Lena raised the key and thrust it toward the altar. The moment it made contact, a blinding light filled the room, and the shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The chains holding the man shattered, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The red light faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Lena staggered back, the key still clutched in her hand. The man looked up at her, his black eyes glistening with something she couldn't place. Gratitude, fear, or maybe both. You've only just begun, he said, his voice hoarse. This isn't over. The room began to shake violently, the walls cracking and crumbling. Lena didn't have time to think. She grabbed the man's arm and pulled him to his feet. We have to get out of here, she shouted. Together, they ran toward a new passage that had opened in the wall, the sound of collapsing stone echoing behind them. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, dark and narrow, the air thick with the stench of damp earth and decay. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she helped the man stumble forward, his steps uneven and weak. Behind them, the sound of the collapsing chamber grew louder, the walls shuddering as if the entire underground structure were coming apart. Keep moving, Lena urged, her voice echoing off the narrow stone walls. I can't, the man gasped, stumbling to his knees. Lena dropped to his side, gripping his arm. You have to. Whatever's back there isn't going to stop. The man looked at her, his hollow, black eyes glistening with pain and something else, resignation. You don't understand. This isn't just about me. You've unleashed something you can't contain. Lena shook her head, her grip tightening on his arm. Then tell me what's going on. What is this place? What was that thing? Before he could answer, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The walls of the tunnel began to crack, thin streams of dirt and rocks cascading down. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the passage, the sound so primal and powerful that it sent a wave of cold terror through Lena's body. We don't have time for this, she said, hauling the man to his feet. Move. They pressed forward, the tunnel narrowing further until they had to stoop to avoid hitting their heads on the jagged ceiling. The roar grew louder behind them, accompanied by the distant sound of shattering stone and the wet, slithering noise of something massive moving toward them. What is that? Lena demanded, glancing over her shoulder. The man's expression darkened. It's awake. You woke it? I didn't wake anything, she snapped. You brought the key, he said, his voice low and accusatory. That's all it needed. Lena bit back a retort, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The tunnel was growing steeper now, angling downward into what felt like an even deeper abyss. The red glow from earlier had faded, replaced by an unnatural darkness that seemed to press against them like a living thing. Finally, the tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the first, but no less unnerving. The walls were lined with jagged, blackened stone, and the floor was covered in a strange, viscous liquid that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it sat another box, larger than the one Lena had found upstairs, but carved with the same strange, writhing symbols. "No," the man whispered, his voice filled with dread. "What is it?" Lena asked, her eyes locked on the box. "It's the source," he said, taking a step back. "The heart of it all. We can't be here." Lena's curiosity burned hotter than her fear. She stepped toward the pedestal, her gaze fixed on the box. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe as she approached, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Don't," the man pleaded, his voice trembling. Lena hesitated, her hand hovering over the lid. "If this is the source, then maybe we can stop it. Maybe we can end whatever's happening." "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "That box isn't meant to be opened. It's meant to contain." The roar from the tunnel grew louder, closer. The walls of the chamber trembled, and the viscous liquid on the floor began to ripple. Lena turned to the man, her frustration boiling over. "If we leave this thing here, it'll find us. We need to do something." The man shook his head, his black eyes filled with despair. "Once you've touched the key, there's no stopping it. The only way to survive is to run." Lena's jaw tightened. She was tired of running, tired of being chased by something she didn't understand. If this box was the source of it all, then she had to take the risk. Ignoring the man's protest, she placed her hands on the lid and pushed it open. The moment the lid lifted, the room exploded with light. A blinding, searing white light that burned into Lena's eyes, forcing her to turn away. The roar from the tunnel turned into a deafening screech, and the walls of the chamber cracked and crumbled. When the light faded, Lena turned back to the pedestal. The box was empty. "No," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have you done?" Lena didn't have time to answer. The liquid on the floor surged upward, forming tendrils that lashed out toward her. She stumbled back, narrowly avoiding one of the tendrils as it slammed into the pedestal, shattering it into pieces. The tendrils twisted and writhed, forming a shape, something massive and otherworldly, its form shifting and undulating in ways that defied logic. It had no face, no eyes, but Lena could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. "Run!" the man shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the far end of the chamber. A new passage had opened, its entrance framed by the same writhing symbols that had adorned the box. Lena didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward it, the man close behind her. The creature roared, its tendrils lashing out, tearing through the walls and ceiling. The chamber began to collapse, chunks of stone crashing to the floor as Lena and the man dove into the passage. They ran blindly, the sound of destruction echoing behind them. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until it felt like they were being squeezed from all sides. Finally, they emerged into a new room, a small, circular space with a single door on the far side. The door was made of the same dark wood as the others, its surface carved with even more intricate symbols. Lena approached the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the key. It felt heavier now, its surface hot to the touch. "What's behind this one?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. He was staring at the door, his expression unreadable. "Is it the way out?" she pressed. He shook his head slowly. "There's no way out. Not anymore." Lena's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "This isn't a place you escape from," he said, his voice hollow. "It's a place you survive, if you're lucky." Lena turned back to the door, her mind racing. She didn't have a choice. The creature was still behind them and there was no going back. She slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that spiraled upward. Unlike the previous staircases, this one was bathed in a soft, golden light that seemed to radiate warmth. Lena hesitated, glancing back at the man. "Go," he said, his voice firm. "I'll hold it off as long as I can." "What? No. You're coming with me." He shook his head. "This is where I belong." "You don't?" Before she could argue, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The creature's roar echoed through the passage, growing louder and more menacing. "Go!" the man shouted, shoving her toward the staircase. Lena hesitated for only a moment before turning and running up the stairs. The golden light grew brighter with each step, the warmth washing over her like a soothing balm. Behind her, the sounds of the creature and the man's screams faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When she reached the top of the stairs, she found herself standing in a small, sunlit clearing. The air was fresh and crisp, the sky above a brilliant blue. But something was wrong. The clearing was surrounded by a dense forest, its trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching toward her like skeletal hands. And in the distance she could hear it, the faint hum growing louder. Lena's relief turned to dread as she realized the truth. She hadn't escaped. She'd only just begun. Lena stood frozen in the clearing, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The sunlight felt strange against her skin, warm but oddly oppressive, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching her every move. The hum in the distance was growing louder, a low droning sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath her feet. She turned back to the staircase she had climbed moments ago, expecting to see the doorway, the tunnel, or even the dim light of the underground chamber. But there was nothing there. No staircase, no doorway, just an unbroken expanse of dense forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. Her heart sank. There was no way back. The hum grew louder, closer, and Lena's sense of unease deepened. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a living force that seemed to pulse through the air around her. She scanned the forest, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for the source of the noise. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a subtle ripple in the fabric of the forest. But as she focused on it, the shape became clearer. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body cloaked in what looked like flowing black smoke. It had no discernible features, no face, no eyes, no mouth, yet Lena could feel its gaze, sharp and unrelenting, cutting through her like a blade. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so intense it felt like her body was betraying her. The figure began to move, gliding silently through the trees. The hum grew louder with each step it took, the air around it shimmering like heat waves on asphalt. Lena forced herself to breathe, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. What do you want?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The figure stopped, its smoky form swirling and shifting. For a moment, Lena thought it might respond, but instead, the hum shifted in pitch, becoming a sharp, piercing whine that sent pain shooting through her skull. She clutched her head, dropping to her knees as the sound grew unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Lena opened her eyes, her vision blurred with tears. The figure was gone, but the clearing had changed. The bright sunlight had dimmed, replaced by a sickly, pale glow that bathed the area in an eerie light. The trees were closer now, their twisted branches reaching down toward her like claws. The ground beneath her was no longer grass but a thick, black sludge that oozed around her knees. She scrambled to her feet, her hands slick with the strange, tar-like substance. Panic clawed at her chest as she turned in circles, searching for a way out. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was low and guttural, like the rumble of distant thunder. Lena spun around, her eyes wide. The man from the tunnel was standing at the edge of the clearing, his black eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. But something was different about him. His skin was darker now, almost gray, and his movements were jerky and unnatural, as if he were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "You're not real," Lena said, backing away. The man tilted his head, his lips twisting into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Real enough. More real than you want me to be." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You opened the box," he said, taking a step closer. "You let it out." "Let what out?" "Everything." Lena shook her head, her hands balling into fists. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to." "Survive?" The man interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think survival is an option now? You think this place will let you leave?" "I don't even know where I am," Lena said, her voice rising. "What is this place? What's happening to me?" The man's smile faded, his expression turning grim. "This is the threshold. The place between what was and what will be. And you're the bridge." "The bridge?" Lena repeated, her mind struggling to process his words. "You opened the box," he said again. "You carried the key. Now you're part of it, whether you like it or not." Lena shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "No, that's not possible. There has to be a way out." "There is no way out," the man said, his voice flat. "Not for you." Before Lena could respond, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The black sludge began to bubble and churn, rising in thick, oozing waves that threatened to engulf her. The man stepped back, his expression unreadable. "It's coming? What's coming?" Lena shouted, her voice barely audible over the rising roar of the sludge. "The end," he said simply. Lena didn't wait to find out what he meant. She turned and ran, her feet sinking into the sludge with every step. The thick, viscous substance clung to her legs, slowing her down, but she pushed forward, her desperation fueling her movements. Behind her, the roar grew louder. She glanced back over her shoulder and saw the sludge rising into the air, forming massive, writhing shapes that towered above the trees. They were humanoid in shape but grotesque and distorted, their bodies made entirely of the same black substance that covered the ground. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the edge of the clearing. The trees loomed over her, their branches intertwining to form a barrier. She pushed through, the sharp, gnarled branches tearing at her skin and clothes. On the other side of the barrier, the forest was darker, the air colder. The hum had returned, softer now but no less unsettling. Lena paused to catch her breath, her eyes darting around the shadowy woods. The man's words echoed in her mind. "You're the bridge." "What does that even mean?" she muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. As if in response, the hum grew louder. The trees around her began to shake, their branches whipping through the air as if caught in a violent storm. Lena pressed herself against the nearest tree, her heart pounding. And then she saw it. A doorway standing in the middle of the forest. It was made of the same dark wood as the others, its surface carved with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with an inner light. Lena hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay away. But she didn't have a choice. The sludge creatures were closing in, their guttural roars echoing through the forest. She stepped toward the doorway, her hand trembling as she reached for the key around her neck. The moment the key touched the lock, the doorway swung open, revealing a blinding light. Lena stepped through, her breath catching in her throat as the world around her shifted and changed. She was no longer in the forest. She was standing in a small, dimly lit room, the walls covered in strange, glowing symbols. In the center of the room was another pedestal, and atop it sat a third box. Lena's stomach dropped. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Lena stood in the dimly lit room, her chest heaving as she stared at the third box. The air was thick, suffocating, and the glowing symbols on the walls seemed to pulsate in time with her racing heartbeat. Her fingers brushed the cold key around her neck, its weight suddenly feeling heavier than ever. She didn't want to move closer. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to run, but where? There was no way out, no escape from whatever this was. The pedestal was small, the box sitting atop it unnervingly similar to the first two. The dark wood gleamed under the faint light, and the carvings on its surface seemed more intricate, more alive. It was as though the box itself was breathing, waiting for her to make the next move. Lena took a tentative step forward. The symbols on the walls grew brighter, their glow intensifying until the entire room seemed to throb with energy. She froze, her instincts telling her that this box would not be like the others. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why is this happening to me?" There was no answer. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers hovering just above the box. The air around it was cold, so cold it made her skin prickle. And then, before she could stop herself, she pressed her hand against the surface. The room shifted violently. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she felt herself falling, her stomach lurching as she tumbled through an endless void. There was no light, no sound, just an overwhelming sense of emptiness that swallowed her whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the falling stopped. Lena landed hard on a cold, uneven surface, the impact jarring every bone in her body. She groaned, rolling onto her side as she tried to catch her breath. The air here was different, stale and metallic, with an underlying scent that made her stomach churn. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a massive, cavernous space. The walls were jagged and dark, shimmering faintly as though coated in some kind of oily substance. The floor was uneven, littered with broken shards of rock and strange, unidentifiable objects. Above her, the ceiling stretched high into the shadows, too far for her to see. The only light came from a faint, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Lena pushed herself to her feet, wincing as pain shot through her ankle. She limped forward, her eyes darting around the cavern as she tried to get her bearings. That's when she saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing motionless in the shadows. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figures were human-shaped but unnaturally still, their outlines blurred as though they weren't entirely solid. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the cavern. The figures didn't respond. She took a cautious step closer, her heart pounding. The glow from the walls illuminated the nearest figure, revealing a face that made Lena's blood run cold. It was her. The figure looked exactly like her. Same face, same hair, same expression, frozen in an eerie, lifeless stare. Its eyes were dull, its skin pale and translucent, as though it were a ghostly imitation of her. Lena stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. She turned her head and saw more of them, identical copies of herself, each one standing perfectly still, their faces devoid of emotion. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The air around her grew colder, and the hum returned, low and insistent. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, resonating deep in her chest. She backed away from the figures, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a trick of the light or the stress. But the copies didn't waver. They remained perfectly still, their empty eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. Lena turned and ran. Her footsteps echoed through the cavern, the sound bouncing off the walls and growing louder with each step. The glow from the walls began to fade, plunging her deeper into darkness. And then she heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of her own heartbeat. But as she ran, it grew louder, more distinct. Lena. She stopped in her tracks, her chest heaving as she spun around. The cavern was empty, no figures, no light, nothing but the oppressive darkness pressing in around her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice echoing. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Lena." It was her own voice. She backed away, her pulse racing. "Stop it. Leave me alone." The whisper turned into a chorus, dozens of voices all calling her name in perfect unison. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, as though the cavern itself were alive and screaming at her. Lena clapped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. Her knees buckled and she fell to the ground, tears streaming down her face. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Lena looked up, her vision blurred with tears. The cavern was still dark, but the glow from the walls had returned, faint and flickering. She wiped her face with trembling hands and forced herself to stand. In the distance she saw something new. A doorway. It was identical to the others she had encountered, but this one was massive, its frame carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. Lena hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But there was no turning back, not now. She limped toward the doorway, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached it, she placed her hand against the cold, carved surface. The door swung open, revealing a blinding light. Lena stepped through, her breath catching as the light enveloped her. She was no longer in the cavern. She was in a room, small, sterile, and impossibly white. The walls were bare, the air unnaturally still. In the center of the room stood a single chair, and sitting in that chair was a man. He looked ordinary, middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes. But there was something about him that made Lena's skin crawl. He smiled at her, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm and measured. "We've been waiting for you." The man's words echoed in Lena's mind like a distant thunderclap. We've been waiting for you. Lena's chest tightened as she studied him. He looked ordinary, almost painfully so. His gray suit was pressed, his shoes polished to a gleaming shine. But his eyes, those eyes weren't ordinary. They were cold, calculating, like they could see straight into her soul and pull out secrets she didn't even know she had. Her instinct was to run. But where? The door behind her had vanished the moment she stepped into the room. The walls were seamless, as if this space had no end or beginning. She was trapped. "Who are you?" Lena asked, her voice shaky but defiant. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here." "Where is here?" she pressed, her fists clenching at her sides. "And why are you waiting for me?" The man leaned forward in the chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've been moving through doors, Lena. Unlocking pieces of something much bigger than you realize." His tone was calm, almost conversational, but it sent chills down her spine. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice rising. "I just wanted to survive." "And yet, here you are," he replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Survival has brought you to the edge of something extraordinary." Lena's pulse quickened. "You're not answering my questions." The man stood abruptly, and Lena instinctively took a step back. Despite his average height and build, there was something imposing about him, like he carried a weight that could crush her if he chose. "You're standing at the center of it all," he said, gesturing around the room. "The choices you've made have led you here, to the crossroads. But now, Lena, the real question is, what are you going to do with what you've unlocked?" She narrowed her eyes, anger and fear swirling in her chest. "What do you mean, unlocked? I don't even know what's happening to me." The man's smile widened, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Oh, but you do. Deep down you felt it. The pull, the whispers, the growing awareness. The boxes were never just objects. They're pieces of a puzzle, a key to something ancient, something powerful. And you, Lena, are the one who brought them together." Lena shook her head, disbelief flooding her mind. No, that's not true. I didn't ask for this. I didn't. You did, he interrupted, his voice sharp but still eerily calm. Every step you've taken, every decision you've made, has brought you closer to this moment. The boxes didn't find you by accident. She felt her legs weaken and she stumbled backward until her back hit the wall. Her breathing was ragged, her vision blurring as her mind tried to process his words. This isn't real, she whispered, more to herself than to him. The man took a step closer, his presence filling the room. Oh, it's real. More real than anything you've ever known. You're standing on the threshold of something far greater than you can comprehend. But the question remains, are you ready to cross it? I don't understand, Lena said, shaking her head. Cross what? What are you talking about? He gestured to the chair he had been sitting in. Sit. I'm not sitting anywhere, she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. He shrugged as if her defiance didn't matter. Suit yourself. But if you want answers, you're going to have to face what's on the other side of the final door. As if on cue, a new door materialized on the far side of the room. It was identical to the others she had encountered, its dark wood gleaming, the intricate carvings pulsating faintly with light. No, Lena whispered, shaking her head. I'm not opening it. I've had enough of these doors. You don't have a choice, the man said simply. Lena's fists clenched. There's always a choice. Is there? He asked, raising an eyebrow. You've come this far, Lena. You've seen what lies behind the other doors. Do you think turning back is even an option now? She glared at him, her mind racing. He was right, there was no way back. The door she had entered through was gone, and the room itself seemed to pulse with an unspoken command. Move forward. But the thought of opening another door, of stepping into another nightmare, filled her with dread. What's behind it? She asked, her voice barely audible. The man's expression softened, just slightly. The truth? Lena hesitated, her heart pounding. And if I don't want the truth? Then you'll stay here, he said, gesturing to the empty room. Forever. The weight of his words sank into her like a stone. She looked at the door, its carvings almost hypnotic, and then back at the man. I hate this, she muttered. He chuckled, the sound low and humorless. Most do. Lena took a deep breath, steeling herself. Her hands trembled as she approached the door, her fingers brushing against the cold, carved surface. The key around her neck seemed to vibrate as though it was alive, urging her forward. She lifted it, fitting it into the lock. The door swung open with a deafening creak, and Lena stepped through, her entire body tense with anticipation. On the other side was nothing. At least that's what it looked like at first. She was standing in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath her feet was smooth and cold, like polished stone, but there were no walls, no ceiling, just an endless void stretching in every direction. And then she saw them. Figures, hundreds of them, slowly emerging from the darkness. They were the same as before, ghostly copies of herself, their faces blank, their movements jerky and unnatural. But these weren't stationary. They were moving toward her. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the figures closed in, their lifeless eyes fixed on her. She stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. Stop, she shouted, her voice echoing in the void. Stay away. The figures didn't stop. And then, just as they were about to reach her, they froze. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the space. Lena. It wasn't her voice this time. It was something else, something ancient and powerful, like the rumble of the earth itself. She turned toward the source of the voice and saw something. It was massive, its shape constantly shifting, impossible to pin down. It glowed faintly, its edges blurring into the void. What are you? She asked, her voice trembling. I am the beginning, the voice said. In the end, Lena's knees buckled and she fell to the ground. I don't understand. You don't need to understand, the voice replied. You need only to choose. Choose what? To become, it said simply. Lena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to live. And you will, the voice said. But not as you were. The boxes have marked you. You are no longer merely human. You are the bridge between worlds. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't want this. It is not about what you want, the voice said. It is about what you are. The shifting form moved closer, its presence overwhelming. Lena felt its power pressing down on her, crushing her under its weight. And then everything went black. Lena awoke to silence. Not the usual oppressive kind of silence, but the sort that carried a weight, a tension that seemed to hover just beyond her reach, as if waiting for her to do something. Anything. She blinked against the sudden brightness that filled her vision, her mind sluggishly catching up with reality. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Her body was sore, and her head throbbed as though she'd been struck by something hard, like a freight train that had passed through her skull. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw she wasn't in the void anymore. The room around her was stark, almost clinical. The walls were made of smooth white stone, the kind that looked too perfect, too polished to be real. It felt as though she was trapped in some kind of laboratory, sterile, cold, and devoid of any warmth or human touch. Lena sat up, her heart racing, and took in her surroundings. She was lying on a simple cot, nothing more than a thin mattress with rough, unyielding sheets. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, the kind of smell that made you want to scrub your skin clean. She pushed herself off the cot, standing unsteadily on her feet. Her legs were shaky as if the ground was unfamiliar. She stumbled forward a step, but managed to catch herself on a metallic table nearby. There were no windows, no doors, just the stark, unfeeling walls. The only thing that seemed real was the pulsating, low hum that vibrated through the floor, making her chest tighten with unease. She wasn't alone. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound. In the far corner of the room there was a chair, a single figure sitting in it. This one, like the man from the room before, wasn't entirely real either. It was a shadow, blurred at the edges, its form constantly shifting, as though it couldn't quite decide what shape it wanted to take. Lena's breath hitched. She backed up, her feet dragging against the smooth floor as her gaze locked on the figure. The shadow moved, its form solidifying into a more recognizable shape. It was a man, tall and angular, dressed in dark clothing. His face was obscured by a hood, but the eyes, those eyes, they gleamed in the dim light. Bright, unnervingly so, as though they were not meant to be seen by human eyes. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, his voice smooth, yet carrying an undertone of warning. "None of you should be here." Lena swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "Who are you?" The figure's head tilted, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture that made her stomach churn. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at her, his eyes boring into hers as if trying to see beyond her flesh and bones. "You don't know, do you?" the figure continued. "You think this is just some nightmare that you'll wake up any moment. But that's not going to happen. This is real. This is the world you've stepped into." Lena shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "No, this isn't real. None of this can be real. It's just," she faltered, the words catching in her throat. "You were chosen," the figure said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Just like the others before you." "Chosen for what?" Lena demanded, stepping forward despite her unease. Her hands were trembling, but her mind was starting to clear. There was something she needed to know, something that felt like it was just out of reach. The figure let out a low, humorless chuckle. "That's the question, isn't it? You think you're special, that you've done something to deserve this. But no, you're just another piece in a much bigger game. A game that's been played for centuries." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. "A game? What are you talking about?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he stood slowly, his movements fluid, unnervingly graceful. He reached for something behind him, something Lena hadn't noticed until now. A large stone door hidden in the shadows. The sound of grinding stone echoed through the room as he pushed it open, revealing a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. "Come," he said simply. "There's no turning back now." Lena didn't move at first. The air in the room had changed, the hum from before now replaced with an almost unbearable silence. Her gut twisted as she stared at the darkness, her mind screaming at her to run. But her feet were glued to the floor, the uncertainty, the fear rooting her in place. The figure seemed to sense her hesitation. "You can't escape what you've started, Lena. Whatever happens next, you're a part of this now." "I didn't choose this," she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. "I didn't ask for any of it." The figure's lips twitched, a slight smile crossing his face. "That doesn't matter. What matters is what you do now. You can't undo the past. You can only face what comes next." Lena's eyes darted toward the stone door again. The darkness beyond it was overwhelming, but it felt like the only option. There was no turning back, not anymore. She had come too far, and there was no way out, no way to reverse what had been set in motion. She was trapped in this game, whether she wanted to be or not. With a heavy sigh, Lena took a step forward. The air grew colder, heavier, as she moved closer to the door. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, her thoughts racing. She wasn't ready for whatever was behind it. But she didn't have a choice. The figure stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Go on," he said, his voice low. You'll find the answers you're looking for. Or maybe, you'll wish you hadn't. Lena hesitated for a brief moment, her stomach churning with dread, but then she stepped into the darkness. The air grew thick as she crossed the threshold, the shadows wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn around, to run, to find another way. But she kept moving forward, her legs shaking as the world around her dissolved into nothing. It felt like she was walking through an endless void. No walls, no floor, just the sensation of moving through something that wasn't quite there, something that didn't belong. And then, out of the blackness, she saw something. A faint glimmer of light in the distance, the only thing that seemed real in this vast, empty space. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold air, and slowly the light grew brighter. She wasn't alone anymore. Lena's heart pounded as the light in front of her grew, its warmth cutting through the oppressive darkness like a beacon. Every step she took toward it seemed to make the shadows shrink back, and yet the feeling of being watched never left her. It wasn't just the figure from before that haunted her. This darkness seemed alive, a creeping presence that curled around her ankles, trying to pull her down. She pressed on, her body trembling but determined. Each breath was shallow, her chest tight with fear, but her mind was clearer now than it had been in what felt like an eternity. Whatever this place was, it was far from the reality she had known. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending she wasn't losing her grip on it. The light was growing brighter with each passing second, but it wasn't just the intensity that confused her, it was the way it shimmered, as if it wasn't completely solid. It flickered like a flame caught in a gust of wind, and Lena's skin crawled with the feeling that it was luring her in. She reached out, almost instinctively, her fingers brushing the edge of the glowing mass. It was warm, but not in a comforting way. It felt like a warning, like a force she wasn't meant to touch. But she couldn't stop herself. There was something about it that felt familiar. Something about the light that tugged at her, calling her forward like an echo from a distant memory. The moment her hand made contact, the world around her seemed to shift. The darkness seemed to pull away, unraveling like a frayed thread. The cold air became warmer, the weight on her chest lifted slightly, but in its place, something else pressed in. A sense of urgency, a ticking clock, like time itself had started to race. Lena, the voice came deep and resonant, echoing all around her. It was the same voice from before, the one that had warned her, but now it sounded different, closer, more urgent. Lena spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Only the light, now blindingly bright, illuminating the space around her. The shadows had retreated, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was alone. But that didn't mean she was free. There was something about the silence that felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. "You're not ready for this," the voice continued, now filled with a strange kind of sorrow. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "I'm not ready for what?" Lena's voice was unsteady, but she forced herself to speak. She needed answers, needed something to make sense of the chaos swirling around her. But the voice didn't answer right away. Instead, the light flickered again, this time more violently, as if reacting to something unseen. Lena stepped back, fear knotting her stomach. She couldn't explain it, but the air felt different, charged as though something was about to happen. Something big. And then, just like that, it happened. The light surged forward in a rush, engulfing her completely. For a split second, there was nothing but bright, blinding white. No sound, no thought, no feeling. Just pure, overwhelming light. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light receded. Lena was standing in a new place, one that seemed both familiar and completely alien. The walls were made of the same polished stone as the room before, but this time there were cracks running through them, jagged lines that looked as though they had been there for centuries. The floor was uneven, a sharp contrast to the smooth surface she had just crossed. It felt real now, like she was no longer in some kind of dream or illusion, but in a place that had existed long before her arrival, and would likely outlast her. The air was thick with the scent of dust and age, as if this space had been abandoned for far too long. It felt old, ancient even, and Lena had the overwhelming sense that she had stumbled into a forgotten world, one that was never meant to be disturbed. She looked around, her breath catching in her throat. There was no exit, no windows, only the dark stone walls that stretched upward, their tops hidden in shadow. The only light came from above, a soft, flickering glow that seemed to pulse with life. It illuminated the center of the room where something stood. Lena's feet moved of their own accord, pulling her toward it. She didn't know why, but she felt as if whatever was in the center of the room held the answers she needed. It was a large pedestal, made of the same stone as the walls, but intricately carved with symbols she couldn't understand. On top of the pedestal sat a box, similar to the one she had encountered before. It was smaller than the others, but just as intricately designed, the carvings on its surface pulsing with the same eerie light that filled the room. Her heart thudded in her chest as she approached it. She felt like she was walking toward her doom, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. The moment her hand brushed against the box, a shock of energy coursed through her body. Her entire being trembled with the force of it, as though every cell in her body was being awakened, reshaped, remade. No, the voice cried out again, louder this time. But Lena couldn't pull away. She couldn't stop herself. The light from the box was pulling her in, stronger than ever before. You don't understand what you're doing, the voice continued, frantic now. This will change everything. But Lena was beyond reasoning now. She felt as though she was no longer in control of her own actions. Her body moved without her will, her fingers pressing against the lid of the box, prying it open. And inside, she found what she had been seeking. It wasn't just an object. It wasn't just another key to another door. It was a vision, one that filled her mind with images so vivid, so real, that they felt like memories she had forgotten, buried deep within her mind. Images of a place, a city, a world that wasn't like anything she had ever seen. Towering spires reached toward the sky, glowing with a light that was both unnatural and beautiful. People moved through the streets, their faces familiar, but not her own. They were the same as her, the same as all the other copies, the same as those figures she had seen in the void. And then a figure appeared, a figure she knew. It was her, but it wasn't her. The figure moved toward her, a twisted reflection, and Lena's heart stopped as their eyes met. It was the same figure she had seen in every doorway, every moment of this nightmarish journey. The one who had been waiting for her. The one who had been leading her here. Lena's hand shot up to her chest, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She could feel her heart racing, a sense of dread flooding her veins. She couldn't escape. Not now. Not ever. You've seen it now, the voice said, softer this time. The truth? Lena's hands shook as she closed the box, the light flickering one last time before fading into nothing. The room around her grew colder, darker. The sense of urgency faded, leaving her feeling empty, hollow. She wasn't just trapped in a game anymore. She was part of something far bigger, and there was no way out. The world was no longer the same. Lena knew that as soon as the last flicker of light had vanished from the box, swallowed up by the darkness around her, the very air felt different now, heavier. The oppressive silence she had once feared seemed to have dissolved, replaced by a constant, pulsating hum, an undercurrent of something vast, something ancient, something that seemed to reverberate deep within her chest. Her fingers trembled as she wiped the cold sweat from her brow, trying to gather her thoughts, but they scattered like shards of glass. Each piece too sharp to touch, too difficult to piece together. What had she seen? What had she uncovered? The vision of the city, the spires, the strange reflection of herself. It all felt too real, too vivid to ignore. But the most terrifying part was that she knew deep down that it wasn't just a vision. It was a memory. Not her memory, but someone else's, someone who had walked the same path before her. Lena took a shaky breath, her mind racing as she looked around the room. The stone walls seemed to close in on her, and for the first time, she understood the weight of the silence. It wasn't empty, it was watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. With her pulse pounding in her ears, she took a step back, only to stumble as her legs refused to carry her. She hit the cold stone floor with a dull thud, pain shooting up her spine, but she barely registered it. Her hands dug into the ground as she sat up, her gaze still fixed on the pedestal where the box had been. The carvings on the pedestal were now glowing faintly, as if in response to something she had done, something she had triggered by opening the box. Her eyes darted around the room. There was no escape. The same unyielding stone walls stretched infinitely in every direction, the shadows gathering in the corners like living creatures, waiting for something to happen. Lena's heart hammered faster as her thoughts spiraled. What now? She whispered to herself, the words barely escaping her lips. What the hell am I supposed to do? But no one answered. There were no voices this time, no mysterious figures, no disembodied warnings. The room was silent again, the hum gone. It was as if she were alone, completely and utterly alone. She stood up, her body unsteady, and began to pace. There had to be a way out. She couldn't be the only one who had ever come this far, right? Someone had to have been through this before. The city, the strange reflection of herself. It wasn't some random hallucination. She had seen it for a reason. But what did it all mean? As the seconds dragged on, Lena's mind spun faster. There was a chance. No. There was a certainty that the answers lay beyond the walls, beyond whatever game had been set in motion. But she had no idea how to reach them. Every instinct in her screamed at her to turn back, to run, to escape this place before it consumed her too, but something deeper, something primal, held her in place. The same force that had driven her to open the box was still at work, pulling her forward. But now she could feel the pressure of the choices ahead. Every decision, every step carried consequences, ones she wasn't prepared for. Not in the slightest. Her eyes flitted around the room again, and that's when she saw it. Crack. At first, it was so small, so insignificant, that she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. But the longer she stared at it, the clearer it became. It ran along the stone wall at the far end of the room, a jagged line cutting through the smooth surface. The edges of the crack shimmered, the stone around it pulsing in time with the low hum that had returned. Lena took a tentative step forward, her breath catching in her throat. This was it, her chance. She reached out to touch the crack, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The moment she did, the room shifted. The ground beneath her feet vibrated, and the walls groaned as if they were waking from a deep slumber. The crack widened slowly, as if inviting her to enter, to push forward into whatever lay beyond. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as if the very air around her was alive, trying to communicate something to her. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, and the crack expanded enough for her to fit through. The darkness beyond beckoned her, but it didn't feel like the same darkness she had encountered before. This felt different, more tangible, more real. Lena hesitated, her hand still pressed against the crack, as if it might close up at any moment, as if the opportunity to move forward might vanish before her eyes. She could still hear the voice from before, echoing in her mind, warning her. You don't understand what you're doing. But that voice wasn't enough to stop her anymore. She had come this far. She had to know the truth. With a shaky breath, she stepped through the crack, moving into the unknown. The world around her seemed to fold in on itself as she stepped beyond the walls of the stone room. The crack seemed to pull her in, its edges becoming blurry and formless, distorting reality as she moved forward. The air was thicker here, and the temperature dropped several degrees. She could see her breath mist in front of her face as she took another step. The ground beneath her was uneven, covered in dirt and what looked like ancient symbols carved into the earth. The walls, if they could be called that, were made of rough stone, covered in moss and vines that had twisted their way up from the floor like living things. Lena's heart raced, each step she took echoing in the silence. The further she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The hum that had filled the room was gone now, replaced by an eerie stillness. It felt like she was walking through a tomb, a forgotten place that time had long since abandoned. She reached for the walls, her fingers brushing against the cold stone, and that's when she noticed it. Another crack, larger this time, splitting the stone in front of her like the mouth of a cavern. It pulsed, faintly glowing as though it were alive, a heartbeat in the dark. Lena's breath caught in her throat. There was something about that crack, something that felt significant. She couldn't explain why, but it was as though it was calling to her, urging her to step closer, to uncover what lay hidden inside. But she hesitated. What if this was another trick? What if opening it would lead her deeper into whatever dark place this was? But she knew, even as the thought crossed her mind, that there was no turning back. She had already opened one box, already stepped beyond the threshold, and now there was only one way forward. With a final, trembling breath, Lena pressed her hand against the crack. Immediately, the room shook violently, the walls groaning in protest as they began to shift. The crack widened further, the earth beneath her feet trembling as if some ancient mechanism had been triggered. The darkness beyond the crack seemed to swirl, pulling her in like a vortex. For a moment, Lena felt weightless, suspended in time and space, her body caught between two realities. And then, with a final deafening sound, the walls fell away completely, leaving her standing on the edge of something vast, something incomprehensible. The landscape before her was nothing like she had ever seen. The air was thick with tension, a biting cold that seeped deep into Lena's bones. The landscape before her was impossible, a swirling mass of shadows and light that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual movement. Every time she tried to focus on one point, it shifted, elusive like a dream that refused to take shape. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, the earth cracked and twisted as if it had been shaped by some unnatural force. It stretched endlessly in all directions, stretching far beyond the horizon she could barely make out. The sky above was a strange shade of dark purple, clouds swirling and breaking apart in strange rhythmic patterns that had no earthly explanation. Lena's heart thudded in her chest as she took a step forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was caught between awe and terror, unable to fully comprehend the enormity of what lay before her. She had crossed over into something entirely different, somewhere outside of time, outside of reason. This place was not meant for any human to step foot in. It was raw, untamed, ancient. "Where am I?" she whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. The moment she spoke, the air around her seemed to shift. A low hum filled the space, not unlike the one she had heard before, but this time it was more persistent, almost as if it were alive, breathing in time with the rhythm of her own pulse. It was as though the very atmosphere responded to her presence, as if she had triggered something that had been dormant for ages. Lena spun around, her heart racing. She had not seen anyone enter this place with her. No figures, no voices, just the strange, distant hum. And yet, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Her skin prickled with the awareness that she wasn't alone, that someone, was lurking just out of sight, hidden in the shadows, watching her every move. The air felt heavy with their presence, an invisible force that pressed in from all sides, suffocating her, making it impossible to breathe freely. She pushed forward, her feet dragging through the cracked earth, her mind spinning with questions. What was this place? What had she stumbled upon? This was not some abandoned room, not some forgotten corner of the world. This was something much older, much more dangerous. The farther she moved, the more intense the feeling became. It was as if the ground itself was shifting beneath her, each step she took causing ripples in the fabric of reality. The walls of this place, the space she was in, seemed to stretch, bend, and pulse as if they were alive, breathing in sync with her own heartbeat. Lena stopped, her breath catching in her throat as a strange sound reached her ears. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. A soft, rhythmic tapping. The sound like footsteps, slow, deliberate, purposeful. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the twisting, impossible landscape, the shifting sky, and the ever-present shadows. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. She hadn't expected an answer, but she had to ask. She had to know. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the eerie stillness of the air, thick with anticipation. Lena's heart was pounding in her chest, her palms sweating. Her mind raced. Was it a trick of her senses? Or was someone really out there? And then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet shifted once again, sending her stumbling backward. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as if a new, unseen presence had entered the space. She barely managed to catch herself before she fell, her hands slamming against the cold, cracked earth. "Lena?" The voice was soft at first, a whisper barely louder than the wind. But there was no mistaking it. She had heard that voice before, deep, resonant, almost hypnotic. The same voice that had warned her in the darkness. The same voice that had guided her to this place. But this time it was different. There was a sharp edge to it, a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. "Lena," the voice repeated, closer now, filling her ears with a chill that went beyond temperature. "You have to leave. Now." She turned frantically, her eyes scanning the area, but there was no one. No figure. No shape. Just the vast, empty space around her, the walls still twisting and warping, the shadows growing deeper and more ominous. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" There was no immediate response, only the steady pulse of the strange hum filling her ears, vibrating in her chest. The pressure in the air was unbearable, and Lena felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. To get away from this place, from whatever was waiting for her here. But there was no way out. The shadows around her seemed to close in, folding in on themselves as if they had a life of their own. The landscape before her grew darker, the light around her flickering and dimming, leaving her in a suffocating twilight. The voice spoke again, but this time it was different. It was not the voice she had heard before. This one was distorted, twisted, as if it were coming from deep within the earth itself, from a place beyond the boundaries of space and time. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its tone full of malice. "You are already too far gone." Lena froze, her heart stopping in her chest. Her breath caught, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "What do you mean?" she choked out, her voice barely audible, as if the very air was pulling her words from her lips. "You're not meant to be here," the voice said. "You were never meant to find this place. But now that you have," the voice trailed off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Lena stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't make sense of what was happening. The shadows seemed to reach out toward her, tendrils of darkness curling around her ankles, pulling her deeper into the abyss. "Get out," the voice screamed, this time full of desperation. "Before it's too late." But it was already too late. The darkness surged forward, and Lena had no choice but to fall into it. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the black void around her, consumed by the shadows that had taken over. There was no escape, no way out. Everything went black. When Lena awoke, she felt as if she had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. Her body was heavy, weighed down by an invisible force, and the air around her was thick with a damp, oppressive chill. The darkness lingered, but it was not complete. A faint, eerie glow lit the surroundings, just enough for her to make out shapes. A twisted, jagged landscape that seemed both alien and familiar at the same time. Her head throbbed, and for a moment she could barely breathe, the air feeling thick, almost suffocating. She sat up slowly, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what had just happened. Her last memory was of the overwhelming pull of the darkness, the shadows reaching for her, swallowing her whole. And then, nothing. Lena rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the fog from her mind, and as she did, the world around her sharpened into focus. She was no longer in the strange, shifting place she had been before. The landscape here was something different, something more defined, but still unsettling. It was as if she had been transported to the edge of reality itself, where the rules of the world no longer applied. The ground beneath her was cracked and uneven, the earth scarred as if something enormous had once moved through it, leaving deep, jagged lines. The sky above was a strange, sickly green, swirling with clouds that moved in unnatural patterns. There were no stars here, no sun, just an endless expanse of shifting, pulsating light. Lena stood up cautiously, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had to know where she was. She had to understand what was happening. As she looked around, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the same silence she had felt in the other place, though. This was different, thick, heavy, suffocating. She could almost hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, a constant reminder that she was alone in this strange world. But she wasn't completely alone. Not anymore. Lena froze as a low, guttural growl filled the air. Her blood ran cold, and she instinctively took a step back, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. And then out of the shadows emerged something that made Lena's stomach churn with dread. It was a creature, its shape barely discernible in the dim light. It moved with a fluid grace, its body sleek and dark, like a shadow-given form. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the gloom as it fixed its gaze on Lena. She felt a chill run down her spine as the creature stepped forward, its claws scraping against the cracked earth. It was enormous, easily twice the size of any animal Lena had ever seen, and its movements were unnervingly precise. It seemed to be calculating her every step, every breath, as though it were waiting for something. Lena's mind raced. She had no idea what this creature was or how it had found her, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't stay here. Without thinking, she turned and bolted, her heart pounding as she sprinted across the jagged landscape. The creature followed, its growls echoing through the air, sending ripples of fear through her chest. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning with the effort, but she couldn't outrun it. She could hear its footsteps, heavy, deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she searched for a way to escape, but there was no escape. The terrain was uneven, the ground rising and falling in sharp angles, making it difficult to get any traction. She stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep her footing. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run any longer, she saw it. A door. A door standing alone in the middle of the wasteland, out of place like something that had been dropped from another world. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she sprinted toward it, her mind screaming for her to reach it before the creature caught her. She wasn't sure what the door led to or how it had come to be there, but it was her only chance. With a final, desperate lunge, she reached the door, her fingers brushing against the cold metal handle. She twisted it, pushing the door open, and without a second thought, she stepped through. The world shifted around her as the door slammed shut behind her, and she found herself in a new place, a place that was equally as strange but somehow quieter. The air here was different, lighter. The tension in her chest began to ease, and for a brief moment, Lena thought she might be safe. But the peace didn't last long. The room she had stepped into was vast, its walls stretching up high into the shadows. The floor beneath her was made of smooth stone, and at the far end of the room, A single figure stood, its back turned to her. It was tall, cloaked in a dark hood, its features hidden in the folds of the fabric. But the presence of the figure was unmistakable. It was powerful, ancient. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she took a step forward, her mind racing. Who was this person? What were they doing here? And more importantly, why had they appeared now, at the moment she needed answers the most? The figure turned slowly, its movements deliberate. When it finally faced her, Lena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Its eyes were black, empty, hollow. There was no warmth in them, no life. Just the endless void of nothingness. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice low and resonant. "You've gone too far." Lena opened her mouth to speak, to ask what this place was, who this figure was, but no words came out. It was as if the very air around her had frozen, blocking her voice, blocking everything. The figure took a step forward, and as it did, the shadows seemed to draw closer, wrapping around it like a cloak. The room seemed to grow darker, the very walls pressing in on her. Lena backed up instinctively, her mind racing for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. "You opened the door," the figure continued, its voice growing colder, sharper. "And now you must face the consequences." Lena's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts spinning. What consequences? What was happening? She hadn't wanted any of this. She had only wanted answers, but now she was trapped. Trapped in a place that was bending her reality, twisting her fate with each passing moment. The figure stepped closer still, and Lena could feel its presence pushing down on her, suffocating her. It was as if it was draining the life out of her, pulling everything from her in slow, agonizing waves. "You opened the door," the figure repeated, its voice now echoing through the room, reverberating in her chest. "And now you belong to it." The ground beneath Lena's feet trembled, and the shadows surged toward her, as if drawn to her, as if they recognized her. Her body froze, her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the darkness closing in around her, just as it had in the other place. But this time there was no escape. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating Lena as she stood frozen in place. Her mind raced, but the words the figure had spoken echoed endlessly in her ears, each one sinking deeper into her consciousness. "You belong to it." The sentence reverberated through her, drowning out everything else. What did it mean? Where was she? And what was this power that seemed to hold her in its grip, twisting her very sense of reality? Her body trembled, not just from fear, but from the weight of the unknown. She was caught in something far beyond her understanding, and she had no idea how to break free. The figure before her loomed larger in the dark room, its presence a chilling, oppressive force. "Who are you?" Lena managed to ask, her voice a mere whisper, struggling against the overwhelming silence that filled the air. But as soon as the question left her lips, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows flickering like distant flames threatening to swallow her whole. The figure's eyes, those endless black pits, fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. It was as if it could see straight through her, past the layers of fear and doubt that clouded her mind, and into her very soul. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never felt before. "I am what you sought," the figure said, its voice low and distorted, like a forgotten memory resurfacing from the depths of the earth. "I am the keeper of this place, the one who watches as the threads of fate are woven and unmade." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "Keeper of this place?" Her throat was dry, and the words barely made it past her lips. "What place? What are you talking about?" The figure took a step forward, its movement smooth and deliberate, as though it was gliding rather than walking. The shadows seemed to grow thicker around it, swallowing the light and warping the room even further. "This is a place outside of time," it explained, its voice growing more distinct, more forceful. "A place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, between reality and illusion, are blurred. A place where you have no control." Lena's mind reeled. This didn't make sense. How had she gotten here? She was just a regular person. A person who had unknowingly stumbled into something ancient and dark, something she was never meant to uncover. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that everything that had happened, every strange occurrence, every disturbing event, had led her to this point. It was as if she was always meant to be here, and that realization chilled her to the core. "But why am I here?" Lena asked, her voice rising with desperation. "I didn't choose this. I didn't want any of this." The figure's hollow gaze softened, but only slightly, its expression unreadable. "You didn't choose this, but you have been chosen," it said cryptically. "There is no turning back now. You are part of the web that holds this world together. You always have been." Lena felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "What do you mean? What web?" What world? The figure extended one long, bony finger, pointing toward the far wall of the room. Lena's eyes followed its movement, but she couldn't make out anything in the shadows, until a faint glow began to seep from the cracks in the stone. It wasn't just light, it was something else. Something alive. The glow spread across the wall like veins of fire, twisting and winding in patterns Lena could not comprehend. It was as if the very walls were alive, pulsating with an energy that seemed to be drawn to her, responding to her presence. "This is the web," the figure said, its voice echoing in the cavernous space. "The threads of fate, of life and death, of all that is and all that could be. It is not just a place, it is a force, a power that binds everything together. And you, Lena, are now caught within it." Lena's heart thudded in her chest as the implications of the figure's words sank in. She had always thought of herself as an ordinary person, someone who lived a quiet life, kept to herself, never seeking anything beyond the mundane. But now, it seemed as though the universe had other plans for her. She had crossed a line and there was no going back. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. The figure paused, its black eyes narrowing as it regarded her for a moment. "Now you must understand. There are things that are not meant to be known, secrets that should remain hidden. But you, Lena, have already uncovered them. And once you know the truth, there is no unknowing." Lena's stomach churned. "What truth?" she whispered, though she was afraid of the answer. The figure slowly turned away, its dark cloak billowing as it moved. "The truth of your existence. The truth of this place. The truth of what lies beyond." It stopped in the center of the room and raised its arms, as though invoking some unseen power. "The truth that has been waiting for you." The shadows in the room seemed to respond to the figure's words, dark tendrils stretching out toward Lena, wrapping around her, pulling her closer. The temperature dropped again, a biting cold that sank into her bones, making her shiver uncontrollably. The figure's voice, now a whisper, reverberated in the air. "You are not just a witness, Lena. You are a part of this world, a piece of the puzzle. And when the time comes, you will play your role." Lena felt a sudden surge of panic. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't want to be a part of this. I just want to go home." But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the wall again, where the glowing veins continued to pulse and twist, growing brighter with each passing moment. The shadows in the room seemed to become more solid, their shapes sharpening, their outlines becoming more defined. And then Lena saw it. In the center of the wall, a figure began to take shape, a shadowy, indistinct form that was somehow both there and not there at the same time. It moved with unnatural fluidity, as though it was made of the very darkness that surrounded it. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it, an apparition, a figure from her past. But this was not just any figure. This was someone she knew, someone she thought she had left behind long ago. Her heart stopped. It was her brother. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the shadowy figure of her brother. It was impossible. She hadn't seen him in years, not since the accident, since that fateful night when everything had changed. Yet there he was, standing in front of her, as if time had never passed. The faint glow of the room highlighted his features, but they were distorted, as if he were made of smoke or mist. His eyes, those familiar eyes that she had once looked into so many times, now glowed a deep, unnatural red. The warmth she had once felt for him was replaced with a chilling emptiness. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers elongated and strange, moving in a way that seemed completely unnatural. "Lena," it whispered, its voice distant and cold, "you should not have come here." Her throat tightened and she took a step back, instinctively recoiling from the figure. "No," she gasped. You're not him. You can't be." The shadow of her brother's form cocked its head to the side, the glow of its eyes dimming momentarily as if it was amused by her reaction. "I'm not your brother, Lena." "Not anymore," it said, its voice taking on an eerie, disembodied quality that sent shivers down her spine. "I was never your brother." Lena's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't possible. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to shake the image from her mind. But when she opened them again, he was still there, standing in front of her, his outstretched hand just inches from her face. The figure's body seemed to ripple, as if it were made of the very air itself, the lines between reality and illusion blurring with every passing second. "No, this is a trick," Lena whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. "It has to be." But deep down she felt it, something in the air was wrong. The energy in the room had shifted, become thicker and colder. The walls seemed to close in around her, pressing in like the crushing weight of a nightmare. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape, but her body was frozen as if bound by invisible chains. Her brother's figure took another step forward, its eyes never leaving her, and the room seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "You didn't listen, did you?" the figure said softly, the voice now a low hum that filled her entire mind. "You opened the door. You reached too far." Lena's breath quickened as the figure moved closer still. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "What have you done to him? What is this place?" The figure's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile, though it lacked any warmth. It was a smile filled with nothing but cold knowledge. "I am what you sought. I am the keeper of forgotten things, of the things that should never have been remembered." Its voice dropped to a whisper, a rasping sound that sent a chill down Lena's spine. "And your brother? He was never truly yours." Lena's eyes narrowed, confusion and horror mingling in her chest. "What are you talking about?" The figure stepped closer still, its form blurring at the edges, its voice now a haunting, distorted echo. "Your brother was chosen long before you ever even met him. You were never meant to have him. He was a part of the game, a part of the plan that you will never understand." The world around Lena seemed to warp and twist as the figure's words sank into her mind. The air grew even heavier, and the shadows around her seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The walls were no longer solid. They shimmered like a mirage, as though they could vanish at any moment. "Enough!" Lena shouted, her voice breaking the stillness. "You're lying. You're just a monster pretending to be him." The figure remained silent for a moment, as though it were considering her words. Then it spoke again, its voice cold and cruel. "I was once him," it said, "but that was a long time ago. What you see before you is something else, something far darker. Something that will never be what it once was." Lena stumbled back, her mind racing. She had to get out of here. She couldn't stay in this nightmare any longer, not with whatever this thing was tormenting her. She turned, eyes scanning the room for any way out, but there was nowhere to run. The figure was blocking her path, and the shadows that filled the space seemed to grow more oppressive with every passing second. The cold was suffocating, and she felt as if the very air around her was closing in on her. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, hidden behind a veil of shadows, there was another door, just like the one she had found earlier. It was small, unremarkable, but it was her only chance. She could feel the pull of it, a distant glimmer of hope in this suffocating nightmare. But the figure was not finished with her yet. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice rising with a sudden, unnatural force. "Not until you face what you have done. What you have awoken." Lena's heart raced, but her legs carried her toward the door anyway. She had no choice. She couldn't stay here, not with this thing standing in her way. She sprinted toward the door, ignoring the growing sense of dread that clawed at her mind. She could feel the figure's eyes on her, burning into her back, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her hand grasped the door handle, but as she twisted it, she felt something strange. A resistance, as if the door itself were fighting her, unwilling to let her pass. Panic surged through her as she yanked harder, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as though it had been sealed shut, locked by an invisible force. Behind her, the figure's voice boomed, shaking the very walls of the room. "You cannot escape. You belong here. You have always belonged here." Lena's breath hitched in her throat. She turned back toward the figure, her body trembling. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let it win. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. But the figure remained unmoved, its form flickering like a shadow in the darkness. "You cannot outrun fate, Lena. Not anymore." The air around her grew colder still, the pressure on her chest almost unbearable. Lena felt as though the very room itself was closing in, its walls bending inward, trapping her in this nightmare. She needed to escape. But how? There was no way out. The door was locked, and the figure was drawing closer, its presence suffocating her. And then, in that moment of pure terror, she realized something. The door was not the way out. The key to her escape lay in the shadows. Lena's pulse thudded in her ears as she faced the figure, unable to escape, trapped in a reality that no longer made sense. The door was useless. It was nothing but an illusion, a mirage that had promised a way out but had only led her deeper into this nightmare. The shadows surrounding her seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, as if they were alive, closing in with each passing second. She turned back to the figure, her eyes wide with panic. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice raw from fear. She had no answers, no way to fight back against this darkness. It felt as if the very room itself were closing in on her, pressing her into the ground. There was no air, no escape. The figure's form flickered again, its face twisting into something that barely resembled human. Its lips pulled back in what could have been a grin, but the expression was nothing like anything Lena had ever seen. It was cold, calculated, and cruel. "Do you truly think you can escape this place, Lena?" it asked, its voice mocking. "You think you can outrun what you've awakened?" Lena's stomach churned. She could feel her thoughts unraveling, the fear and confusion rising within her like a storm. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted any of this. All she wanted was a quiet life, to forget about the horrors of the past and move on. But now it felt like everything was spiraling out of her control. She was caught in something bigger than herself, a force that seemed beyond her understanding. "You think you can just run?" the figure continued, its tone chilling. "You are part of it now, whether you like it or not." Lena's breath hitched as she realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about her brother. It wasn't just about this place. It was about something much deeper, something she had never fully grasped. The figure wasn't simply tormenting her, it was trying to break her. It wanted her to understand that there was no escape, that she was trapped in a cycle that would never end. The air around her grew heavier, and for the first time since she had entered this nightmare, she began to feel something else, an overwhelming sense of guilt. It was as if the walls of this strange space were filled with her own regrets, her own mistakes. Every decision she had ever made seemed to weigh down on her all at once. The air itself seemed to whisper her failures, her fears, her darkest secrets. She could hear it in the corners of her mind, calling her out. "You cannot escape your own truth," the figure said softly, its voice almost tender. "The things you tried to forget, they never leave. They follow you no matter where you go." Lena recoiled, her knees buckling slightly. She had been running for so long, burying everything she didn't want to face. The loss of her brother, the guilt she had carried for years, the unanswered questions that had never been addressed. It had all been there, lurking in the back of her mind, but now it was all too real. The room was alive with it, suffocating her, forcing her to confront every terrible thing she had ever pushed aside. "I didn't mean for any of this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its form shifting as it stepped closer to her. "It doesn't matter what you meant. What matters is what you've become." It raised a hand, and in that instant, Lena felt something she had never felt before, a deep, primal fear, a sense of being utterly insignificant. The figure's power was palpable, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. "What am I supposed to do?" Lena cried out, her voice breaking. "How do I stop this?" The figure tilted its head, studying her as if it were contemplating her very existence. "You can't stop it. You can only face it. You will never escape what's inside of you." For a moment, the figure seemed to disappear, fading into the shadows like it had never been there at all. Lena felt a sharp pang of loneliness as its presence receded, but that didn't last long. The room around her began to shift again, the walls warping as if the entire place was alive and responding to her thoughts. She was surrounded by memories now, by images of things she had long buried. She saw her brother, standing there, smiling as he had when they were children, before everything had gone wrong. She saw her parents, their faces filled with love and warmth, before the accident had shattered their family. But the memories were twisted, distorted by the shadows that had taken hold of the room. "You cannot escape the past," the figure's voice whispered from the darkness, its tone no longer mocking, but something more insidious, more dangerous. "The past is what shapes you. It is what you will always return to." Lena squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the images, trying to block out the memories. She had thought she could bury them, leave them behind. But now they were here, more real than ever, and she could feel them clawing at her mind, pulling her back into the darkness she had tried to escape. But even as the memories overwhelmed her, a thought began to take root in her mind, a single desperate thought. If the past was what held her here, then perhaps it was the only thing that could free her. She had been running from it for so long, but now it seemed like the only way forward was through it. She had to face it. The figure's voice echoed in her mind once more. "You will never be free, Lena. The past will always find you." But now, something inside of her had changed. She wasn't going to let the past control her any longer. She had spent too many years running from it, too many years hiding from the truth. It was time to confront it, to understand the source of her fears and face whatever horrors awaited her. She took a step forward, her body trembling but her resolve strengthening with each movement. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to the figure. "I won't let it win. Not this time." The shadows around her seemed to retreat, as if they were unwilling to fight her determination. She could feel the figure's presence lingering in the room, but it no longer held the same power over her. The fear that had gripped her heart was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else, a glimmer of hope, however small. The walls around her continued to shift, the memories twisting and warping, but she could see the truth now. She had been a part of this all along. Her brother, her family, the choices she had made, everything had led her to this point. The web of fate was tangled, but she could untangle it. She could find a way out. The figure, still lurking in the shadows, seemed to watch her with silent anticipation. "You think you can change your fate?" it asked, its voice cold and dismissive. "You are bound to it. There is no escaping what has been set in motion." Lena took another step forward, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I don't believe that," she said, her eyes locked on the shifting darkness. "I don't believe that anymore." And with that, she stepped into the shadows. Lena stepped into the shadows, feeling an overwhelming chill wrap around her like a suffocating blanket. The air felt heavier than ever, and the weight of her every breath seemed to slow time itself. The walls of the room shifted again, becoming more indistinct, like the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but she hadn't anticipated this. A total disintegration of the world around her. It felt like she was walking through an abyss, an endless void of darkness and fear. The figure's presence still loomed, but it was different now. It wasn't just the shadow of her brother anymore, it was something worse, something far more ancient. It had been feeding off her fear, her guilt, her inability to accept the truth. And now, it was trying to pull her into itself, to make her a permanent part of this nightmare. "You cannot escape me," the voice echoed around her, thick with menace. "You cannot change what has been written." Lena didn't stop walking. She had no destination in mind, but she kept moving forward, her steps sure despite the terror that gripped her heart. The figure was wrong. She knew it now. Everything it had told her was designed to keep her trapped in the past, in a place where the darkness could swallow her whole. But the past didn't have to define her. She had a choice. She had always had a choice. The voice grew louder, angrier, its words crashing against her like waves in a storm. "You will always be bound by your actions, Lena. You will never be free." Lena's eyes blurred with tears, but she wiped them away, determined to not let this entity see her weakness. She had spent her life running from the consequences of her choices, unable to face the truth about her brother, her family, and what had happened all those years ago. But now, as the darkness pressed in from all sides, she realized she didn't need to hide anymore. She couldn't undo what had been done, but she could choose how it ended. The ground beneath her feet began to rumble, shaking with the force of something monstrous. The air turned ice cold, and for a moment she felt the overwhelming urge to turn back, to run away and forget it all. But she resisted. She kept moving. The figure appeared before her again, its form now towering over her, a giant shadow that seemed to devour the very light around it. "You think you are strong enough to defy fate?" it sneered. "You think you can escape your past?" Lena didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was already inside her. She took one more step forward, and then another, her breath steady now, her resolve unshakable. "I'm not running anymore," she said quietly, her voice firm despite the fear that clawed at her chest. "I'm done being afraid." The figure laughed, a hollow, cruel sound that reverberated through the darkness. It reached out with twisted fingers, grabbing hold of her wrist in a vice-like grip. Lena flinched but didn't let the fear overtake her. She focused on the warmth in her chest, the tiny spark of hope that had grown stronger the longer she stood her ground. "Do you think that will save you?" the figure hissed. "Do you think you can outsmart me? You will never escape." But Lena could feel it now, the presence of her brother, not as a shadow but as something real, something alive within her. The warmth she had felt when she first remembered him, when she had embraced the pain of his loss. It was him. Her brother's love had never truly left her. It had been buried beneath her guilt and her fear, but it was still there, waiting for her to acknowledge it. In that moment, Lena understood. This was the true test, not just of escaping the nightmare, but of facing her deepest fears and letting go of the things she had been holding onto. She wasn't alone in this fight. She never had been. The figure's grip tightened and Lena gasped, but she didn't stop. She clenched her fists, drawing strength from the love she had felt for her brother, from the memories of their time together, before everything had gone wrong. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Lena whispered, and with that, she broke free from the figure's grasp. She pushed forward, determined to find the light. For a long moment, nothing happened. The darkness hung heavy in the air, but then something shifted. The room began to fade, the walls no longer pressing in on her, and the shadows seemed to dissipate. The figure's form flickered, its power slipping away as Lena stood her ground. And then, suddenly, it was gone. The room, the shadows, the oppressive darkness, they all disappeared, leaving Lena standing in a quiet space. She was alone, but she felt lighter, freer than she had in years. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She had faced it. She had chosen to move forward. Lena blinked, her eyes adjusting to the soft light that now surrounded her. The world had changed. The nightmare had ended. And yet, she knew that something profound had shifted within her. She would never be the same again, but for the first time she was okay with that. As she stood there, alone but not lost, Lena realized that she had finally found peace. She wasn't running anymore. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face whatever came next. Story 2. The sound of a single distant chime echoed through the night, a sound so faint it could have been imagined. But it wasn't. It was real. And it meant something had begun. Kayla tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, consumed by darkness, with only the faint glow of her headlights slicing through the void. The hum of her car was the only sound in the otherwise suffocating silence. But that feeling, that gnawing, unshakable feeling, was there again. Someone was watching her. She glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights in the distance. There was nothing but black. Still, her heart raced, every fiber of her being screaming that something was wrong. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Kayla startled, letting out a shaky laugh at her own nerves. She grabbed it without looking, hoping for some kind of distraction. A message, a missed call, anything, but the screen had gone black. No matter how many times she pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn back on. "Great," she muttered, tossing it back onto the seat. "Just what I needed." As the highway curved, her headlights caught something up ahead. A road sign, old and battered, standing crooked at the edge of the road. The letters were almost too faded to read, but she caught the words just before she passed. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Kayla frowned. Black Hollow wasn't on the map. She was sure of it. The GPS had shown nothing but a straight route to the next town, but now the device was dead, and she had no choice but to keep going. A glance at the gas gauge made her stomach sink. Nearly empty. She sighed and pressed her foot harder on the gas pedal. The sooner she got through this place, the better. The town appeared suddenly, as if it had been lying in wait, hidden in the shadows. Kayla slowed the car, her eyes darting from one side of the street to the other. The buildings were dark and lifeless, their windows broken or boarded up. There were no street lights, no signs of life, just the oppressive weight of the unknown pressing down on her. Her headlights caught a gas station up ahead, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. The pumps looked ancient, the kind you'd expect to see in an old horror movie. She hesitated but then sighed again. What choice did she have? Kayla pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel loud in the quiet night. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. The silence was suffocating. No wind, no crickets, nothing. She stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. The pump squealed as she lifted the nozzle, and for a moment she wondered if the thing even worked. But gas began to flow, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That's when she heard it. A faint scraping sound like nails on metal. It came from somewhere behind her. Kayla froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly she turned, scanning the darkness. The street was empty, the shadows unbroken. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound confident. There was no response. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. Kayla dropped the nozzle, gas spilling onto the pavement, and scrambled back into the car. She locked the doors and started the engine, her hands shaking as she gripped the wheel. She was about to pull out of the lot when her headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure. It stood motionless at the edge of the station, its features hidden in the shadows. Kayla's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was it a person? An animal? The figure tilted its head as if curious and then took a step forward. Kayla slammed her foot on the gas, her tires screeching as she tore out of the lot. Her heart thundered in her chest as she sped down the empty street, her eyes flicking between the road and the mirror. The figure was gone, but the feeling wasn't. Something was following her. She was sure of it now. The road out of Black Hollow seemed to stretch on forever, the town's oppressive presence lingering like a weight on her chest. Just when she thought she'd finally escaped, her headlights caught another sign. It was the same one she'd seen before. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Kayla's blood turned to ice. She hit the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. This couldn't be happening. She'd been driving straight the entire time. There was no way she'd loop back. The road ahead looked exactly the same as it had before. The gas station was gone, but the eerie silence remained heavier than ever. Kayla's hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white. The chime sounded again. This time it was closer. The chime echoed louder this time, reverberating in the stillness like a warning bell. Kayla sat frozen in the driver's seat, her pulse hammering in her ears. She gripped the wheel so tightly her fingers ached, staring at the faded sign in front of her. Welcome to Black Hollow. Her throat felt dry and her breaths came shallow and quick. This wasn't possible. She had been driving straight, hadn't she? She shook her head, trying to clear the fog of panic creeping in. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she had missed the turn without realizing it. Kayla took a deep breath and muttered to herself, "Calm down. There's gotta be an explanation." But deep down she knew there wasn't. She rolled forward, her headlights cutting through the dense darkness. The road looked identical to what she had just left behind, cracked asphalt, flanked by thick trees that loomed like sentinels. Her knuckles stayed white as she guided the car past the sign, her stomach twisting into knots. The air inside the car felt heavy now, like it was pressing against her chest. She fumbled with the window switch, cracking it open to let in some fresh air. The cool breeze carried a faint, metallic scent that made her wrinkle her nose. As the car crept forward, her eyes scanned the road ahead, searching for any sign of life, any hint of what was happening. Instead, she saw something else, movement in the trees. It was subtle at first, just a rustle of leaves in her peripheral vision. But as she focused, she could see it more clearly. Shapes darting between the trunks. Shadows moving unnaturally fast. Kayla's grip on the wheel tightened even further. "No. No, no, no," she whispered under her breath. Her foot pressed harder on the gas, the car picking up speed. She couldn't stay here. Whatever this place was, she had to get out. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the same haunting monotony over and over. She tried to focus on the horizon, convincing herself that the town had to end eventually. But just as she started to feel a sliver of hope, her headlights picked up something in the distance. Her heart sank. It was the gas station. Kayla's breath hitched as the car rolled to a stop, gravel crunching under the tires. It was exactly the same as before, the flickering neon sign, the ancient pumps, the air thick with unease. She felt her chest tighten, panic threatening to take over. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The chime sounded again, closer than ever. Kayla's head whipped around, her eyes scanning the shadows. It was louder now, sharper, and it sent shivers crawling down her spine. She pressed her foot to the gas pedal, ready to drive straight past the station. But before she could, something stepped into the road. Her stomach dropped. It was a figure. Tall, thin, and completely motionless. The headlights illuminated just enough to see that it was wearing some kind of old, tattered cloak, the fabric hanging limply around its skeletal frame. Its face, or what should have been its face, was obscured by the shadows of its hood. Kayla slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt mere feet from the figure. She sat frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the figure raised one bony hand and pointed to her. Kayla screamed. She threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as she sped backward. The figure didn't follow. It just stood there, arm outstretched, as if silently commanding her to stop. She didn't. The car jerked as she spun it around, speeding back the way she had come. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she gripped the wheel, her eyes darting between the road and her rearview mirror. The figure was gone. But the chime wasn't. It rang out again, louder and sharper, like it was inside her head. Kayla clamped her hands over her ears, momentarily losing control of the car as it veered dangerously close to the edge of the road. She corrected it at the last second, her heart racing even faster. The road ahead seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, as if they were alive. Kayla's mind raced, desperate for an explanation, a solution, anything to make sense of what was happening. Then she saw the sign. "Welcome to Black Hollow." Her scream tore through the night as the car skidded to a stop once more. She slammed her fists against the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't real," she shouted, her voice cracking. "This can't be happening." But the truth was staring her in the face. No matter what she did, no matter how far she drove, she was trapped. The chime sounded again, louder than ever. Kayla whipped her head around, her eyes wide with terror. The back seat was empty. The road was empty. But she felt it, something was there. The air in the car grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that frost began to creep across the inside of the windows. Kayla's breath came out in visible puffs as she frantically searched for the source of the chill. Then she saw it. In the mirror, just for a split second, something moved. A flash of white, a face, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into her soul. Kayla spun around, but the back seat was empty. Her hands trembled as she turned back to the wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to get out of here. She had to keep moving. The engine roared to life as she floored the gas pedal, the car speeding down the endless road. The chime echoed again, and this time, it was accompanied by something else, a low, guttural whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the engine. But as the car sped forward, the whisper grew louder, more insistent, wrapping itself around her like a living thing. "You can't leave." Kayla's scream was lost to the night as the car plunged into the darkness, the whisper and the chime chasing her into the void. Kayla's foot pressed hard on the gas pedal, her car roaring as it tore through the endless stretch of black road. Her hands were shaking violently now, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The whisper still lingered in her ears, circling her mind like a predator waiting to strike. "You can't leave." Her throat felt raw from screaming, but her fear only deepened with every passing second. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the trees growing taller, darker, and closer together. It felt like the world itself was closing in around her. She glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale, hollow face staring back at her. Nothing. The back seat was empty, just as it had been before. But the chill in the air remained, heavy and suffocating, like the breath of something unseen. Kayla's knuckles whitened as her thoughts spiraled. What was this place? Why couldn't she leave? Her mind scrambled for logic, for a solution, but the truth was too horrific to ignore. She was trapped. Suddenly, a loud thud jolted her from her thoughts. The car lurched violently to one side, and she struggled to keep control as it swerved, tires screeching against the pavement. "No, no, no," she shouted, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the engine sputtering before falling silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, she looked up. Her headlights illuminated something in the road. It was long and crumpled, like a bundle of rags, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized it wasn't rags at all. It was a body. Kayla's stomach turned as she stared, frozen in her seat. The figure was motionless, lying face down in the middle of the road. Her mind screamed at her to drive, to run, to get as far away as possible, but the car wasn't moving, and neither were her legs. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, her eyes locked on the figure. Then, slowly, it began to move. The head lifted first, tilting at an unnatural angle as if the neck couldn't quite support its weight. The limbs followed, jerking awkwardly as the figure pushed itself onto its hands and knees. Kayla's breath caught in her throat as the figure turned its head toward her. Its face was pale and gaunt, the skin stretched tight over sharp bones. But its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were the worst part. They weren't human. They weren't even alive. The thing stared at her, its mouth opening slowly, impossibly wide as if to scream. But no sound came out. Kayla slammed her hand on the ignition, her fingers trembling as she twisted the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. Come on," she muttered, slamming the car into reverse. The figure began to crawl toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Kayla's tires screeched as she sped backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't care where she was going, she just had to get away. The figure disappeared into the darkness as she backed away, but Kayla didn't stop. She spun the wheel, turning the car around, and floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as she sped down the road. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep the car straight. Tears streamed down her face as she drove, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The road seemed to go on forever, the trees growing thicker and closer with every passing mile. But then, up ahead, she saw something, a light. It was faint at first, barely visible through the trees, but as she got closer, it grew brighter. Hope sparked in her chest. Maybe it was a house or another car, anything but this endless nightmare. Kayla slowed the car, her heart racing as the light came into view. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a car. It was a lantern hanging from a post at the edge of the road. She stopped the car, staring at the lantern as it swayed gently in the breeze. There was something strange about it, something almost hypnotic. The flame inside flickered unnaturally, casting shadows that seemed to dance and twist in impossible ways. Kayla swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't want to get out of the car, but something about the lantern pulled at her, like a thread unraveling in her mind. Slowly she opened the door. The air outside was colder than before, biting at her skin as she stepped out. The sound of her boots crunching against the gravel seemed deafening in the silence. Kayla approached the lantern, her breath visible in the icy air. As she got closer, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A path, barely visible in the darkness, winding its way into the woods. A small wooden sign stood next to the path, its words carved in jagged letters. For those who seek the truth. Kayla frowned, her heart pounding in her chest. The truth? What truth? The chime sounded again, louder this time, coming from somewhere down the path. Kayla took a step back, shaking her head. No, I'm not doing this, she muttered, turning back to the car. But the car was gone. She froze, her blood running cold. The road was empty, the gravel lot where she had parked completely bare. It was as if the car had never been there at all. Panic surged through her, and she turned back to the path, her mind racing. The lantern's flame flickered again, brighter now, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch toward her. The chime echoed once more, deeper and more insistent. Kayla clenched her fists, her body trembling. She didn't want to go down that path. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to do anything but take another step forward. But what choice did she have? Her legs moved on their own, carrying her toward the path. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, as the chime continued to call her forward. And then she heard it, the whisper. The truth is waiting. Kayla swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. She stepped onto the path, the shadows closing in around her, and disappeared into the darkness. Kayla's footsteps crunched against the dirt path, each sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. The air here was colder than before, so frigid that her breath hung in the air like ghostly mist. The path ahead was barely visible, lit only by the flickering glow of the lantern behind her. But she kept walking, unable to stop herself. The whisper was louder now, more insistent, weaving through her thoughts like a thread she couldn't untangle. The truth is waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat a desperate plea for her to turn back. But the path seemed alive, as though it wouldn't let her leave even if she tried. The trees loomed taller, their gnarled branches curling above her like skeletal hands. Shadows shifted in the corners of her vision, just out of reach, taunting her. Kayla tried to steady her breathing, clutching her arms to herself as the cold seeped through her jacket. Her mind raced with questions. What was this place? Why was she here? And what would happen if she kept going? She rounded a bend in the path and froze. Up ahead, barely visible through the thick darkness, was a cabin. The structure was ancient, its wooden walls warped and blackened as though they had been burned long ago. The roof sagged under the weight of years, and the single window was cracked, its glass smeared with something too dark to be dirt. Kayla's stomach churned, and she hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run as far and as fast as she could. But the whisper returned, clearer now, almost soothing in its tone. You've come this far. Don't stop. Her feet moved again, almost against her will, carrying her closer to the cabin. The cold grew sharper with every step, cutting through her like a knife. She reached the door and stopped, staring at the warped wood. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the surface. They weren't letters, at least not any she recognized. They twisted and curled, almost alive, and staring at them too long made her head spin. Kayla raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the forest like a gunshot. She held her breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the cabin remained silent, still, as though it were holding its breath too. She turned the doorknob. It creaked loudly as it twisted, the sound almost human, like a groan of protest. Kayla pushed the door open, her heart hammering in her chest. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside. The floorboards were warped and splintered, and the walls were covered in the same strange carvings as the door. The air inside was even colder than it had been outside, thick with the metallic scent she had noticed earlier. In the center of the room was a single chair. It faced away from her, its back turned so she couldn't see if it was occupied. The sight of it sent a wave of unease crashing over her, but she couldn't look away. The chair seemed wrong, as though it didn't belong here or anywhere. Kayla took a hesitant step inside, her footfalls creaking against the ancient floorboards. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the chair. The carvings on the wall seemed to pulse in the corner of her vision, growing more vivid, more alive as she approached. The air grew colder still, biting at her skin and making her teeth chatter. She reached the chair and stopped. It was empty. Kayla let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her for a brief moment. But before she could step away, something on the chair caught her eye. It was a photograph. She hesitated, then reached out, her fingers trembling as they closed around the edges of the faded picture. It was old, the paper yellowed and brittle, but the image was clear enough. Her blood ran cold. It was a picture of her. Kayla staggered backward, nearly dropping the photograph. Her heart raced as she stared at the image, her mind struggling to make sense of it. She was sitting in a car, staring straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. This wasn't possible. How could there be a picture of her here? Who had taken it? And why? The whisper returned, louder than ever. You're not alone. Kayla spun around, her eyes darting wildly around the cabin. The carvings on the wall seemed to writhe now, twisting and shifting as though they were alive. Shadows danced in the corners, moving in ways that didn't match the flickering light of the lantern she hadn't realized she was still holding. The door slammed shut. Kayla screamed, dropping the photograph as she ran to the door. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The symbols on the wood seemed to glow faintly, their strange, jagged lines pulsing with an unnatural energy. "Let me out," she shouted, pounding on the door. The chair creaked. Kayla froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she turned around. The chair wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat there, its head bowed, cloaked in shadow. Its hands rested on its knees, long and thin, with fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly far. Kayla backed away, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. She took another step back, her eyes locked on the figure. The air around her grew heavier, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The whisper grew louder, overlapping with itself, filling the room with an unbearable noise. "The truth, the truth, the truth." The figure lifted its head. Its face was a void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull at her, drawing her in. Kayla's legs gave out and she fell to her knees, unable to look away. The void spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You were never meant to leave." The room plunged into darkness. The darkness was alive. It clung to Kayla like a second skin, suffocating her senses and blurring the line between reality and nightmare. She couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't even feel the ground beneath her. It was as if the world had dissolved, leaving her suspended in a void of nothingness. But she wasn't alone. Somewhere in the pitch black she felt it, a presence. It wasn't the figure from the chair, at least not entirely. This presence was bigger, older, something that seemed to stretch beyond her comprehension. And then the whispers returned. "You shouldn't have come." The voice echoed in her head, overlapping with itself, each word dripping with malice. Kayla's body trembled uncontrollably as she clutched at her ears, trying to block out the sound. But it didn't help. The voice wasn't coming from outside, it was inside her, coiling through her thoughts like a serpent. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "Please just let me go." Laughter erupted in the darkness, deep and guttural, like the sound of bones grinding together. "Go? There's nowhere to go." Kayla's heart pounded as the ground beneath her suddenly reappeared, hard and ice-cold against her palms. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting wildly in the darkness. A faint light appeared in the distance, barely more than a pinprick, but it was enough to draw her toward it. Her legs felt like lead, every step a monumental effort, but she pushed forward, desperate to escape the suffocating void. The light grew brighter as she approached, flickering like a dying flame. When she reached it, she froze. It wasn't a flame. It was a mirror. The ornate frame was cracked and blackened, its edges curling like charred paper. The surface of the mirror shimmered faintly, almost liquid, reflecting the faintest outline of her face. Kayla stared at her reflection, her breath catching in her throat. She looked pale, her skin almost translucent, and her eyes were wrong. The irises were black, bottomless pits that seemed to stare back at her with an intelligence that wasn't her own. "What is this?" she whispered, reaching out to touch the glass. The surface rippled beneath her fingers like water, and suddenly the world shifted. She was no longer standing in the dark void. She was in her car. The familiar scent of pine air freshener filled her nose, and the hum of the engine vibrated beneath her. For a moment, she thought it was all over, that she had somehow woken up from the nightmare. But then she looked at the passenger seat. Her heart stopped. Someone was sitting there. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its face obscured, but its presence was overwhelming. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Kayla could feel its eyes on her, watching her every move. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. "You've been driving in circles, Kayla," it said, its voice low and distorted. "You've always been here." Kayla's stomach churned. She turned to look at the road, her eyes scanning the landscape. The trees were the same, the endless stretch of black pavement identical to what she had seen before. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "No, I left that place." The figure laughed softly, the sound sending chills down her spine. "You can't leave what you are." "What I am." Kayla turned to face the figure again, but it was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if it had never been occupied. Her breathing grew shallow as she gripped the wheel, her mind racing. None of this made sense. How could she still be here? What did the figure mean? The car suddenly jerked forward, the engine roaring as if someone had slammed their foot on the gas. Kayla screamed, grabbing at the wheel, but it was no use. The car sped down the road, faster and faster, the trees blurring into dark smears on either side. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Kayla was thrown forward, her seatbelt biting into her chest as the car came to a screeching halt. For a moment there was silence. Then she looked up. The cabin was in front of her again. Her heart sank as she stared at the warped wooden structure. It looked exactly the same as before, down to the cracked window and the carvings on the door. It was as if she had never left. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real." She unbuckled her seatbelt and stumbled out of the car, her legs weak beneath her. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her eyes were fixed on the cabin, dread pooling in her stomach. The door creaked open. Kayla froze, her breath catching in her throat. The inside of the cabin was pitch black, the darkness almost spilling out onto the ground like a living thing. And then she saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, its outline barely visible against the darkness. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its posture unnaturally stiff. "Kayla," it said, its voice a low growl. "It's time." "Time for what?" she whispered, taking a step back. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The shadows clung to it like a second skin, making it impossible to see its face. "Time to remember." Kayla's head spun, memories flashing through her mind like fragments of a broken mirror. A road, a crash, screaming, the sound of shattering glass. Her knees buckled and she fell to the ground, clutching her head as the memories overwhelmed her. "No," she gasped. "No, that's not possible." The figure loomed over her now, its presence suffocating. "You've been running, Kayla. But you can't outrun the truth." The whisper returned, louder than ever, filling her mind with a single chilling phrase. "You've always been here." The world around her began to dissolve, the cabin, the trees, the road, all of it melting away into darkness. Kayla screamed, her voice echoing into the void as she was swallowed whole. Kayla opened her eyes, but the world around her wasn't the one she remembered. It wasn't the cabin, the car, or even the endless road. This place was warped. The sky above was an angry swirl of black and crimson, and the ground beneath her felt like ash, crumbling with each step she took. A dense fog hung in the air, and the silence was deafening. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating, like an invisible weight pressing against her chest. Her head throbbed, fragments of memories flashing in and out of focus. A crash, screams, the tearing of metal. The image of the photograph she'd found in the cabin burned itself into her mind, the lifeless expression on her own face staring back at her. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying in the oppressive stillness. The whisper returned, sharper now, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You know where you are." Kayla stumbled forward, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. She couldn't stay here, wherever here was. The landscape stretched out endlessly in all directions, but in the distance, barely visible through the swirling fog, was a faint light. Something about it felt wrong, too perfect, too bright, but it was her only option. With trembling legs, she began to walk toward it. The closer she got, the more the world around her seemed to shift. Shadows writhed at the edges of her vision, moving in unnatural ways. The ground beneath her feet felt alive, pulsing faintly as though it had a heartbeat. And the whispers, they were everywhere now, growing louder and more insistent with every step. "Do you remember yet? You can't escape. You were chosen." Kayla pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices weren't external, they were inside her, burrowing into her mind like parasites. "Stop," she screamed, her voice breaking. "Just stop." The light flickered in the distance, and for a moment she thought it might disappear entirely. But then it flared brighter, illuminating what lay ahead. Kayla froze, her blood turning to ice. It was the cabin. Again. The same warped wood, the same cracked window, the same suffocating aura of dread. But this time something was different. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, pulsating with a dark, crimson light. And in the window she saw movement. Someone, or something, was inside. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But the whisper came again, cruel and mocking. "It's more real than you think." Kayla's legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop herself from moving forward. It was as though the cabin was pulling her in, drawing her closer with an invisible force. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became, until they were a deafening roar in her ears. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The carvings on the wood seemed to writhe under her touch, burning her skin, but she couldn't pull away. The door creaked open. The interior was darker than before, the air thick and choking. The single chair in the center of the room was gone, replaced by a table. And on that table was a single object. A mirror. It was the same mirror she had seen before, with its cracked, blackened frame and rippling surface. But now the reflection it showed was different. It wasn't her face staring back, it was the figure. Its head tilted, its face still a void of swirling shadows, but its presence was unmistakable. "Why are you doing this to me?" Kayla demanded, her voice trembling with fear and anger. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a single hand, pointing directly at her. The mirror rippled, and suddenly Kayla was pulled forward, as though an invisible force had grabbed her and yanked her toward the glass. She tried to resist, clawing at the air, but it was no use. The mirror swallowed her whole, and the world went dark. She landed hard, the wind knocked out of her as she hit the ground. But this time the ground wasn't ash, it was cold, wet, and familiar. Kayla opened her eyes and gasped. She was back in her car. The dashboard lights glowed faintly, and the soft hum of the engine filled the air. Outside, the forest was silent, the trees still and unmoving. For a moment she thought it was over, that she had somehow escaped. But then she looked at the rearview mirror. The figure was there, sitting in the back seat, its void-like face inches from hers. Kayla screamed, jerking the wheel and slamming on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching against the pavement. She threw the door open and stumbled out, her legs barely supporting her weight. She turned to look at the car, but it was empty. Her breathing was ragged, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She backed away from the car, her eyes darting around the forest. Everything was too quiet, too still. "Kayla?" The voice was right behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. "You can't run." Her pulse raced as she turned back to the car, her eyes widening in horror. The figure was standing next to it now, its towering frame casting an impossibly long shadow. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move. But the whisper returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "Remember?" Kayla's head throbbed, the fragments of memory resurfacing once more. The crash, the screams, the sound of shattering glass. And then, nothing. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not dead. I can't be dead." The figure tilted its head, and for the first time, its voice softened. "You're not dead, Kayla. Not yet." Before she could respond, the ground beneath her gave way, and she was plunged into darkness once more. Kayla's fall felt endless. She plummeted through a black void, weightless and helpless, the air roaring past her. Her screams were swallowed by the nothingness, and the deeper she fell, the colder it became. The temperature gnawed at her bones, but worse was the sensation in her chest, a heavy, suffocating pressure, as though something was squeezing the life out of her. When she finally landed, the impact wasn't what she expected. Instead of pain or broken bones, she found herself standing on solid ground, her body completely unharmed. But the world around her was anything but normal. The sky was blood red, its surface swirling like boiling water. Jagged black mountains rose in the distance, their peaks sharp and menacing, and the ground beneath her feet was an endless field of cracked, charred earth. A distant sound reached her ears, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Kayla turned in a slow circle, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no sign of the figure, no indication of where she was or how she had gotten here. And then she saw it. A figure stood on the horizon, silhouetted against the crimson sky. It was small and distant, but even from this far away, Kayla could feel its gaze piercing through her. Without thinking, she started walking toward it. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground was pulling at her feet, trying to drag her down. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the low moaning sound grew louder, more desperate. When she was only a few yards away, the figure turned toward her. Kayla froze. It was her. The figure was identical to her in every way, same face, same clothes, even the same cuts and bruises on her skin. But there was something wrong with its eyes. They were completely black, bottomless voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. What are you?" Kayla whispered, her voice trembling. The doppelganger tilted its head, a small, chilling smile spreading across its face. "I'm you," it said, its voice an eerie, distorted echo of her own. Kayla took a step back, her stomach churning. "No, you're not. This is impossible." The other Kayla took a step forward, matching her movements exactly. "You can't run from yourself," it said, its smile widening. "No matter how hard you try." Kayla's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The crash, the cabin, the figure, it all felt connected, but the pieces didn't fit together. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice rising. The doppelganger's expression darkened, the smile vanishing. "It's not about what I want," it said, its voice cold and empty. "It's about what you deserve." Before Kayla could react, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, a blinding light pouring out from the fissure. She stumbled back, shielding her eyes, but the light was relentless, burning through her vision. When the light faded, she found herself in a new place. She was standing in the middle of a road. The asphalt stretched out in both directions, lined by dense, shadowy trees. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, though the sky above was clear. It was the same road she had been driving on earlier. Her car was there, parked on the shoulder, the driver's side door hanging open. But something about the scene was wrong. The air felt too still, too quiet, as though the world was holding its breath. Kayla approached the car cautiously, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. When she reached the open door, she froze. There was blood on the seat. A lot of blood. Her heart pounded as she took a step closer, her eyes scanning the interior. The dashboard was cracked, the steering wheel bent, and the windshield shattered. The smell of metal and gasoline was overpowering, making her stomach churn. And then she saw it. A body lay sprawled across the passenger seat, lifeless and broken. The face was turned away, but Kayla didn't need to see it to know who it was. It was her. Her legs gave out and she collapsed to the ground, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. She couldn't be dead. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't happening." But the whisper returned, cruel and relentless. "Do you remember now?" Kayla turned her head sharply, her eyes darting toward the sound. The figure was back, standing in the middle of the road. Its form was more distinct now, its edges sharper, but its face was still an empty void. "What is this?" Kayla demanded, her voice trembling with anger and fear. "Why are you doing this to me?" The figure tilted its head, its presence as suffocating as ever. "This isn't about me," it said. "This is about you. About the choices you made." "What choices?" Kayla shouted, her voice echoing through the still air. "I don't understand." The figure raised a hand, pointing at the car. Kayla turned to look, and the world around her shifted again. She was no longer standing on the road. She was in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, the hum of the engine vibrating through her body. But this time she wasn't alone. A man sat in the passenger seat, his face pale and strained. His hands were clutching a photo, her photo, and his eyes were filled with desperation. "Kayla," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, you have to listen to me. You don't understand what you're doing." "I'm not doing anything," she snapped, her voice laced with frustration. "You're the one who—" The memory shattered, fragments of sound and light swirling around her. When the world came back into focus, she was standing on the road again, alone. Her knees buckled and she fell to the ground, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I don't remember." The figure stepped closer, its presence looming over her. "You will?" The ground beneath her cracked again, and she was plunged into darkness once more. Kayla awoke with a start, gasping for air as though she'd been drowning. The darkness around her was absolute, pressing in from all sides. She could feel the cold ground beneath her, wet and sticky, but she couldn't see a thing. Her heart raced as she reached out blindly, her hands brushing against something slick and unyielding. The whispers returned, louder this time, circling her like a predator stalking its prey. "Do you see it now? The truth you've buried?" Her fingers closed around a jagged rock, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles turning white. "What truth?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "I don't understand. Just tell me what's happening." The only response was laughter, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers racing down her spine. Suddenly, the darkness began to lift, giving way to a faint, flickering light. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay, and as her eyes adjusted, she saw that she was in some sort of cavern. The walls glistened with moisture, their surfaces etched with strange alien symbols that seemed to pulse faintly as though alive. And then she saw them. Bodies. Dozens of them, maybe more, hanging from the cavern ceiling like grotesque ornaments. Their skin was pale and stretched tight over their bones, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Kayla stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. No, this can't be real. But it was real. Too real. One of the bodies moved. It wasn't much, just a faint twitch of the hand, but it was enough to send Kayla's heart into overdrive. She turned to run, but the cavern twisted around her, the walls shifting and closing in. "Let me out," she screamed, clawing at the stone. "Let me out." The whispers grew louder, merging into a single haunting voice. "You can't run from what you've done, Kayla. You can't escape yourself." The world shifted again and Kayla found herself back on the road. But this time it was different. The asphalt was cracked and broken, and the trees that lined it were dead and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. Her car was there again, but it was no longer the pristine vehicle she remembered. The hood was crumpled, the windows shattered, and the inside reeked of blood and gasoline. Kayla approached it cautiously, her eyes scanning for any sign of the figure. She could feel it watching her, its presence an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. When she reached the car, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A notebook lay on the driver's seat, its cover stained with blood. With trembling hands, she picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with her handwriting, but the words made no sense. They were disjointed and fragmented, like the ramblings of a madwoman. Phrases like, "It's all my fault," and "I didn't mean to," jumped out at her, each one sending a fresh wave of panic coursing through her. And then she reached the last page. There was only one sentence written there, scrawled in thick black ink. "You killed him." Kayla dropped the notebook as though it had burned her, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's not true. I didn't kill anyone." But deep down she knew it was. The memories came flooding back, hitting her like a freight train. The argument, the car, the man in the passenger seat. His pleading voice, begging her to slow down, to listen. And then the crash. The image of his lifeless body flashed before her eyes, and she sank to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "It wasn't my fault," she whispered, clutching her head. "It wasn't my fault." The figure appeared before her, its form towering and menacing. But this time it didn't speak. It simply stood there watching her. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "Haven't you done enough?" The figure tilted its head, and for the first time, Kayla thought she saw something in its void-like face. Pity. "This is not punishment," it said, its voice low and resonant. "This is the truth you've been running from. The truth you need to face." Kayla shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to kill him. It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "But you did." The ground beneath her began to crack, and she felt herself being pulled downward. She clawed at the earth, struggling to hold on, but it was no use. The darkness swallowed her whole, and she fell once again. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the cabin. The chair was there, sitting in the center of the room, and the mirror was back on the wall. But this time, the mirror didn't show her reflection. It showed the crash, the twisted metal, the shattered glass, and the lifeless body of the man she had killed. Kayla turned away, unable to bear the sight. "Why are you doing this to me?" she cried. "Why can't you just let me go?" The figure appeared behind her, its presence filling the room. "Because you haven't let yourself go." Kayla turned to face it, her hands clenched into fists. "What do you want me to do?" The figure pointed to the mirror. "Face it." She hesitated, her heart pounding. But she knew she didn't have a choice. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the mirror. As she looked into it, the scene began to change. She saw herself sitting behind the wheel of the car, tears streaming down her face. The man in the passenger seat was shouting at her, his voice muffled but filled with desperation. And then she saw the moment of impact. The memory was so vivid, so real that it felt like she was reliving it. The sound of metal tearing, the screams, the blinding pain, it was all too much. But she didn't look away. When the memory ended, the mirror went dark, and Kayla saw her own reflection staring back at her. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her. Acceptance. The figure stepped closer, its form beginning to fade. "You've faced your truth," it said, its voice softer now. "But the choice is still yours." "What choice?" Kayla asked, her voice trembling. To stay or to move on? The room began to dissolve around her, the walls crumbling into ash. Kayla closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "I'm ready," she said, and then there was nothing. Kayla awoke to silence. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the darkness she had grown accustomed to, but a peaceful, almost comforting stillness. She opened her eyes, half expecting to find herself back in that bleak cavern or alone on the desolate road. Instead, she was lying on soft grass, bathed in the warm light of an early morning sun. The air smelled fresh, crisp, and filled with the scent of pine. For a moment, she thought she had woken from a nightmare. But as she sat up, the reality of it hit her. She was no longer in the twisted place of shadow and terror. This wasn't the world she had fallen into before. This was peaceful. She scanned her surroundings. Tall, lush trees stretched above her, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The ground was soft, untouched by the death and decay she had witnessed earlier. The sky was a pale blue, dotted with fluffy clouds that drifted lazily. In the distance, she could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, sounds that were unmistakably real, human. But there was a nagging feeling in her chest, a strange emptiness that she couldn't shake. The stillness was peaceful, but it was too perfect, too calm. It didn't feel right. Kayla stood, brushing the dirt off her clothes, her senses heightened. Something was out of place, but she couldn't quite figure out what. The last time she had been in a place like this, the world around her had turned dark and twisted. Was she still trapped? Had she really escaped? She began walking, not sure what she was looking for, but knowing she had to keep moving. There was no clear path, but the grass beneath her feet was soft and lush, and she followed an instinctive pull. Her heart began to beat faster as she walked deeper into the forest, her steps slow but purposeful. Every so often, she'd glance over her shoulder, but there was no sign of the dark figure, no twisted mirror reflecting the horrors she had faced. But even though the surroundings had changed, there was one thing that hadn't: the whispers. They were faint, almost like a soft hum in the back of her mind. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the residual effect of the nightmares she'd lived through. But soon, the whispers became clearer, words that crawled beneath her skin. "Do you think you're free? Do you think you're done?" Kayla froze. The voice sounded so close, as if the speaker were standing right behind her. She whipped around, her pulse racing, but saw nothing. Just the same peaceful forest, the same clear sky. "What's happening?" she whispered to herself. "What is this? This isn't freedom." The voice was deeper now, more menacing. "You're not free, Kayla. Not yet." The world seemed to tilt. The calmness she had felt was slipping away, unraveling like thread from a spool. Kayla stumbled backward, tripping on a tree root. As she hit the ground, her vision blurred and her body felt heavy. Her pulse quickened as she struggled to catch her breath, but the air seemed to grow thinner with each passing second. The trees around her twisted and bent in unnatural ways, their branches reaching out like long, bony fingers. The warm sunlight faded, leaving only a dim, cold light. The once soft ground became sharp and jagged, cutting at her skin. "You can't escape," the voice repeated. "You never could." Kayla scrambled to her feet, panic flooding her chest. The forest wasn't what it seemed. The perfect, peaceful scene was dissolving before her eyes, revealing the true, twisted nature of the place. "No, no, I won't go back," she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. But the ground began to shift beneath her again. The once soft grass turned to sand, slipping away as though it had never existed. The trees bent inwards, their trunks bending like tortured flesh. The sky darkened to a sickly green, the clouds swirling ominously. "Face it," the voice echoed as if the world itself were speaking to her. "This is your doing." Kayla clenched her fists, her body trembling with fear. She didn't know where she was anymore, didn't know if she was even alive. Had she died back in the crash? Was this some sort of afterlife, or was it all part of a greater punishment? She didn't know. But she did know one thing. She wasn't finished here. Not yet. "You'll never escape," the voice whispered again as the world continued to break apart around her. "Not until you understand what you've done." Kayla's vision grew dark as the ground began to crack beneath her. The forest split apart, pieces of it falling away into nothingness. The earth began to tremble, the very air vibrating with a deep, thunderous growl. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she fell once again into the void, the world disappearing entirely. Kayla awoke again, this time in a completely different place. She was lying on a hard surface, the smell of metal and oil filling her nose. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the dim light above her. She was in the middle of a dark room, the walls made of cold, gray steel. Her body ached as if she had been through a battle, but there was no blood, no signs of injury. And then she heard the sound. A door creaked open. A pair of heavy footsteps echoed in the silence, slow and deliberate. Kayla turned her head toward the sound, her pulse racing. Was it the figure again? Or was this something else? The door clicked shut and the footsteps stopped. A voice spoke from the darkness. "You're awake." Kayla sat up, the cold metallic floor beneath her pressing sharply against her skin. Her muscles screamed in protest, and she felt a deep, unsettling weariness settling over her. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was something far darker. She had felt like this before, after she had run from everything, when she had locked herself away from the truth. But now there was nowhere to hide. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Every muscle seemed to refuse, as though they had all been drained of life. The room around her was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. It hung like a dying star in the center of the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The air smelled of damp metal, sterile and suffocating. The faint hum of machinery buzzed softly in the background, like a distant heartbeat, steady and relentless. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, too dry. Her voice cracked, breaking the silence with an eerie rasp. What is this place?" The answer came, soft and steady, as though it were echoing from all around her. The voice was familiar, its tone cold and indifferent, like something from her past. She had heard it before, but where? What? "It's where you'll face the truth, Kayla. Where everything comes together." The sound of footsteps reached her ears, growing louder, closer. Kayla's heart skipped a beat, and she jerked her head toward the source. The door across the room creaked open, slowly, almost deliberately. The faint sound of rustling clothing filled the air, followed by the sharp click of heels against the concrete floor. She could hear the person before she saw them, the weight of their presence heavy, like a storm brewing on the horizon. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall, imposing. Was the figure. Kayla's breath caught in her throat, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The last time she had seen it, it had been lurking in the shadows of the cavern, its dark form impossible to ignore. Now it was stepping into the light, and for the first time Kayla could see it fully. It was human in shape, but it wasn't human in nature. The figure wore a suit, sharp and black, its face obscured by an impenetrable shadow. The more she looked at it, the more she realized that the figure wasn't bound by the same rules as the world around her. It seemed to distort the space around it, bending reality in ways Kayla couldn't comprehend. Every step it took seemed to make the room around her feel smaller, more confined. "Who are you?" Kayla's voice was a whisper, barely audible. But it didn't matter. The figure heard her. It always did. "Who I am is irrelevant," it said, its voice low and resounding, almost as if it were coming from within her own head. "What matters is who you are, and what you've done." Kayla felt a sharp pang in her chest. "I haven't done anything," she protested, her voice rising in frustration. "I'm not like this. I didn't, asterisk asterisk." The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming her. There was nowhere to hide now. She was trapped, locked in this place with this thing. "You think you didn't do anything?" The figure repeated, its voice mocking. "You think you've been innocent all along?" The room seemed to close in on her. The walls, once gray and cold, now seemed to pulse, moving as though they were alive. Kayla backed away, stumbling over her own legs. But the figure followed her, each step bringing it closer until it was standing right in front of her. The air grew thick with tension. The silence was suffocating, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "You can't escape it, Kayla. You know the truth. You've known it all along, asterisk asterisk," the figure whispered. Kayla's mind reeled. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "No, I haven't. I don't remember, asterisk asterisk." "Of course you don't remember," the figure interrupted. "You buried it, didn't you? You tried to erase it just like you've done with everything else. But you can't escape what's already inside you." Kayla closed her eyes, squeezing them shut. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to believe it. But a nagging feeling, a dark, oppressive weight, settled deep in her gut. She had felt it before, in the moments when she dared to look back at her past. There was something she had done, something that she couldn't outrun. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The figure smiled, or at least Kayla thought it did. It wasn't a smile of warmth or sympathy. It was a smile of knowing, of understanding. "You think this is just about the accident? Just about one moment. But it's not, Kayla. Kayla's breath caught in her throat. She felt dizzy, disoriented. I don't know what you mean, asterisk, she choked out. Oh, but you do. You know exactly what I mean. The crash wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something far worse. The room seemed to shift again, the ground beneath her feet becoming unstable. She tried to steady herself, but the world was tilting, spinning, falling apart. The walls bent and swayed as though they were alive, as though they were pulling her into them, suffocating her. Kayla's stomach twisted with nausea. She was choking on something. Something she couldn't understand, something she didn't want to face. You made a choice, Kayla. You made it the moment you drove away. You chose to bury the truth, to hide it, and now you're paying the price. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. It was as if the room itself was taking away her voice, strangling her with its overwhelming presence. You don't get to walk away. Not this time. Not again. The figure's voice had become low, guttural, a growl. It sounded as though it were coming from the very walls, from every corner of the room. Kayla's heart thudded against her ribcage. She felt sick. The weight of what the figure was saying crashed down on her, suffocating her, burying her in layers of guilt and fear. What do you want from me? She finally managed to gasp. I don't know what you're talking about. I want you to face it. Face what you've done. Face what you've always known deep down. Asterisk, the figure answered, its voice now more of a command than a suggestion. You can't hide from yourself anymore. The room was no longer just a room. It was a trap, a cage that was closing in on her. Kayla's breathing became shallow, panicked. She felt as though she were suffocating, the walls pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers grew louder, each word more insistent than the last. Face the truth, Kayla. It's time. The floor beneath her cracked, and she dropped to her knees, her hands scrambling to find purchase in the shifting world around her. She was drowning in the darkness, suffocating in the weight of her own fear. But then a voice pierced through the chaos. A voice she knew. A voice she remembered. It was his voice. Kayla? Her heart froze. The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was real. It was right there. She turned toward the sound, but there was no one. There was nothing. You didn't mean it. You didn't mean it. The words echoed in her mind, the memory of his voice reaching out to her like a lifeline. For a brief moment she saw him, his face, his kind eyes, his pleading, desperate gaze. But then it was gone, and the darkness swallowed her whole again. The coldness settled into her bones, the kind of cold that didn't just freeze the body but reached deep into the soul. Kayla had been in places like this before, places where the air itself seemed to press in on her, suffocating her in a way she couldn't escape. But this was different. This wasn't just darkness. It was a shadow that lived, breathed, and stretched through her very being. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for something, anything, that would offer her an answer. But there was nothing. Nothing except the same walls, the same crushing stillness. Is this it? She whispered, her voice trembling, more from exhaustion than fear. Is this where I'm supposed to stay forever? A faint, mocking laugh echoed from somewhere behind her, and she whirled around, heart racing. But there was no one there. Only the empty room. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a hesitant step backward. You can't escape it, Kayla. The voice came again, closer this time, as though it were right beside her, whispering in her ear. Kayla spun around, but again nothing. The space was empty. She was alone. Or at least she thought she was. You thought you could leave it behind, didn't you? The voice was clearer now, colder, its edges sharp like the crack of ice underfoot. You thought you could outrun your mistakes. Mistakes. The words sliced through her, sharper than any physical wound. She could feel the weight of it, the weight of everything she had done and everything she had left undone. There was something she had missed, something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. I didn't have a choice. She shouted, the words pouring out before she could stop them. I didn't have a choice, okay? I had no choice. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of her words, the air thickening, charging with an energy that wasn't quite human. No choice? The voice whispered mockingly. Didn't you? Or did you choose to ignore the truth instead? Her breath quickened as the darkness seemed to pulse around her, pulling at her very soul. She had never truly faced what had happened that night. The accident. The flash of headlights, the screeching of tires, the sound of the crash. She had pushed it all away, ran from it. But now there was nowhere to run. Kayla sank to her knees, clutching her head in her hands as the memories flooded back. She could see his face, his eyes, wide with shock and fear. She could hear his voice, soft and pleading. "Kayla, please?" The sound of his voice echoed in her mind over and over. She had heard it so many times before, but now it wasn't just a memory. It was real. The guilt crushed her chest. She had failed him. She had left him there, alone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice broken. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I never meant to hurt you." The room around her shifted again, as though the very walls were closing in. She gasped, her breath shallow, the world spinning as the shadows stretched out, swirling around her. And then she saw it. A figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't the figure from before. No, this one was different. It was him. No, it can't be. Her voice faltered as she stumbled to her feet. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but when she looked again, the figure was still there. Still standing in the doorway, his face just as she remembered. His eyes, his features, they hadn't changed. He wasn't speaking, but she could hear his voice in her mind. Soft, warm. "Kayla?" She took a step toward him, her heart thundering in her chest. But the moment she moved, the world began to crumble. The walls buckled, the ceiling split open, and the room started to disintegrate into dust. The floor beneath her cracked, splintering into pieces that fell away into the abyss below. "No," she cried out, reaching for him, her fingers outstretched. "Please don't leave me. Don't go." But he didn't answer. He simply stared at her, his face unreadable, as though he were waiting for something. Kayla felt herself falling. She reached out to grab him, but her hand passed right through him, as though he were nothing more than smoke, fading into the nothingness. She screamed, but her voice was drowned by the roar of the falling building, the thunderous crash of it breaking apart. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. There was only silence. The world around her had disappeared completely. There was no room, no walls, no figure, just an endless void. Kayla collapsed to the ground, the weight of everything settling heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't escape. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. No whispers, no voice, no sound, just the dark emptiness surrounding her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice small and desperate. "Why is this happening?" A cold laugh filled the void. "You know why," the voice said, its tone filled with a twisted amusement. "Because you chose to forget. You chose to live in the lie." The words struck her like a physical blow, and Kayla closed her eyes, trying to block them out. But it didn't matter. The truth was already there. It had been there all along, buried deep inside her, and now there was no escaping it. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, more to herself than to anything else. "I never meant to." But before she could finish, the void around her shifted once more. This time, the darkness receded, revealing something else. Something far worse. She was standing in the middle of the road. The very same road. The one where everything had started. The headlights flashed before her eyes, blinding her. She could hear the screech of tires. The crash. The terrible, sickening sound of metal against metal. The roar of the engine as it careened out of control. Kayla's heart stopped. She felt paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. The world around her spun as time stretched, rewound, and repeated itself in endless loops. And then she saw him again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but it was too late. Everything had already been decided. The silence that enveloped Kayla was deafening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood in the middle of that deserted road, the same one that had haunted her for so long. The headlights blinked in and out of her vision, the screech of tires echoing through her mind like a twisted lullaby. But this time it wasn't just a memory. It was real. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be happening again." The cold air wrapped itself around her like a suffocating blanket, and she felt the icy fingers of fear grip her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape, but her feet were frozen to the asphalt, unable to move. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, to find a way out, but there was no escape from the road. No escape from the past. A figure appeared before her, walking slowly from the shadows, each step echoing in the night. Kayla's breath caught in her throat as she recognized him. The same man she had seen before. The same face, the same eyes. His presence was like a magnet, pulling her in despite the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume her. "You," she gasped, stepping back instinctively. "Why are you here?" The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. His gaze was enough to speak volumes. His eyes filled with an emptiness that sent chills through Kayla's entire being. She had seen that look before, back when it all started. The crash, the screams, the regret, the guilt. I didn't mean to," Her voice faltered, her mind spinning with 1,000 unspoken words. But he didn't respond. Instead, he took another step forward, and the world around them seemed to shift. The darkness grew deeper, more suffocating. Kayla's legs trembled beneath her, but she couldn't look away. The figure was closer now. Too close. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But the man simply stood there, unmoving, watching her with those cold, lifeless eyes. And then, slowly, he raised his hand. Kayla's heart skipped a beat as she followed his movement. What was he going to do? Was he going to hurt her? Was he going to make her relive it all over again? And then, before she could even think, the figure reached out and touched her arm. The world exploded. Pain so sharp, so consuming, it was like 1,000 knives stabbing into her flesh at once. Kayla screamed, but no sound came out. She was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare where nothing was real, yet everything felt painfully true. Her body convulsed, her vision blurring as the man's grip tightened. Her heart raced. It felt like it was going to burst from her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. "This is it, Kayla," the voice echoed, soft and cruel. "This is where it all ends." The words felt like a death sentence. She had come so far, but now, at this moment, she realized there was no escaping the past. It had been chasing her from the very beginning, from the moment the crash happened, from the moment she made the choice to run. And now it had caught up with her. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to break free, but it was no use. The man's grip was unrelenting, and the world around her seemed to close in. Her vision faded to black. The darkness enveloped her completely, pulling her deeper into an abyss where there was no light, no sound, no escape. Kayla felt herself floating, untethered from reality, as if she were no longer in her own body, no longer herself. She was adrift, lost in the void of her own mind. "It's not real," she whispered to herself, though the words felt empty. "None of this is real. It's just a nightmare. I can wake up. I can... But even as she said the words, she knew they were lies. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real. It was the truth. The truth she had been running from all this time. The truth that had been chasing her through every corner of her life, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it would finally drag her down into the depths. The man's touch still lingered on her skin, cold and unyielding like a brand. His presence pressed in on her, filling her mind with images of the crash, the screech of tires, the blinding headlights, the horrifying sound of metal twisting and bending, the helpless feeling of being unable to stop it, of knowing that nothing could ever undo the damage. "Why did you leave me?" A voice echoed through the darkness. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Why did you leave me to die?" Kayla's heart skipped a beat. The voice. It wasn't the man who had been standing before her. It was someone else. Someone she knew. Someone she had tried to forget. She clenched her fists, desperate to block out the memory, but it came anyway. The face. The eyes. The pleading expression. She had seen it that night, the night of the accident. She had seen it, but she hadn't acted. She had let him suffer. She had let him die. No, I didn't mean to," Kayla sobbed, her body racked with pain, guilt, and the crushing weight of what she had done. I didn't know. But it didn't matter. The words were useless now. The damage had already been done. She had chosen to run. She had chosen to leave him there. The darkness shifted, and Kayla found herself standing in a new place, an abandoned hospital room, cold and sterile. The walls were cracked, peeling, and the air was thick with dust. She could hear the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, buzzing softly as if the room were alive. "Kayla," the voice came again, this time much clearer, much closer. She spun around, her heart racing in her chest. There, lying on a bed in the center of the room, was the figure. The man from before. But this time he wasn't standing. He was lying down, motionless, his face pale and lifeless. "No," Kayla whispered, taking a hesitant step toward the bed. Her legs shook beneath her, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. She had to see it for herself. As she approached, the man's eyes slowly opened, but there was no recognition in them. No warmth. No life. Just empty, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. "Why did you leave me?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through her like a knife. Kayla fell to her knees beside the bed, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch him. But when her fingers brushed against his skin, it was ice cold. His body felt like stone, lifeless, unyielding. I'm sorry, she cried, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you. But he didn't respond. He just stared at her with those empty eyes as though he were waiting for something. Waiting for her to admit the truth. The truth that she had tried so hard to ignore. I didn't know. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know you were... Her voice trailed off as the reality hit her. She hadn't known. But that didn't matter. She had still made the choice. She had still left him there. And now there was no escaping it. No way to undo what she had done. I'm sorry, she whispered again, the words feeling so hollow, so empty as they fell from her lips. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, and for a brief instant, Kayla thought she saw something in them. Something other than emptiness. A flicker of recognition. A flicker of forgiveness. But just as quickly as it came, it vanished. The room around her began to fade, the walls crumbling away, leaving nothing but a swirling darkness. The man was gone, and so was the hospital room. Everything was gone. Kayla stood alone, her body trembling with exhaustion and guilt. The darkness stretched out before her, infinite and suffocating. And though she didn't know what was coming next, she knew one thing for sure. She could never escape the consequences of her choices. The crash, the screams, the guilt. It was all a part of her now. It was part of who she had become. And no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, it would always be with her. There was no escape. There was no forgiveness. Just the cold, unrelenting truth. Kayla's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the empty air around her. The cold was unbearable, seeping into her skin, her very bones. It felt as if the darkness itself were alive, pressing in on her from all sides, wrapping itself around her throat like a vice. There was no escape, no way out. She wanted to scream, but the sound died in her throat before it could escape. Her body refused to obey her. It felt as if her limbs had been turned to stone, anchored in place by some invisible force that denied her the right to move. Her mind was spinning, memories flashing before her eyes. The crash. The way time seemed to slow as the car spun out of control. The deafening sound of metal grinding against concrete, the sudden silence that followed. And then, the weight of what she had done, the choices she had made. It wasn't my fault, she tried to tell herself, but the words felt hollow, empty. Her own voice seemed foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. The truth was simple. She could lie to herself all she wanted, but the reality was undeniable. She had run. She had turned her back when he needed her most. The man, his face, his eyes, everything about him haunted her. She had left him there on the side of the road, abandoned and alone. She could still hear his voice, his last breath, as the life drained from his body. Why did you leave me? That question had followed her for days, for weeks, tormenting her when she tried to sleep, when she tried to forget. But forgetting wasn't possible. The past wasn't something she could outrun. The moment she had made that choice to leave him behind, it had sealed her fate. There was no going back, no way to erase the pain. And now, here she was, standing in the middle of the void, facing the consequences of her actions. The man's face was burned into her memory, his eyes accusing, demanding answers that she could never give. A voice broke through her thoughts, cold and distant, yet so close that it felt like it was inside her mind. You thought you could run. You thought you could escape. But you can't. The voice wasn't the man's, it was something darker, something older. It resonated deep within her chest, making her bones ache with fear. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere around her was suffocating. She could feel it, creeping closer, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her vision blurred. She felt her knees weaken, as though her body could no longer hold the weight of the guilt pressing down on her. She was falling into the abyss, and the more she tried to claw her way out, the deeper she sank. No, I didn't mean to, she whispered, but the words were useless. The guilt, the regret, the weight of the truth, it was all too much. She couldn't deny it anymore. She couldn't escape the fact that she had left him there. She had chosen to save herself, to protect herself, and in doing so, she had doomed him. I was scared, she tried to reason with herself. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help him, but even as she said it, the words felt like lies. The truth was simple. She had made a choice. And now, that choice was ripping her apart from the inside out. The darkness around her seemed to close in even more, and she felt herself being pulled deeper into it. It wasn't just a physical force, it was an emotional one, a crushing weight that seemed to press on her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. And then she saw him. He was standing before her, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes empty just as they had been when he died. But this time there was something different about him. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no rage. There was only sorrow. "You left me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed through the darkness like a scream. Kayla felt the tears come then. They flowed freely, uncontrollably, as if they were the last thing she had left. She collapsed to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached out toward him. But when her fingers brushed against his skin, it was cold, colder than ice. It felt like she was touching death itself. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to, ***. But the words faltered, dying in her throat. The truth didn't need words. It was there all around her. She had known. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had made the choice and it had cost him his life. "I didn't mean to." Her voice trailed off as she stared at his lifeless face, a face that had once been full of life, full of warmth. Now it was a mask, frozen in time, a reminder of the one thing she could never undo. "It's too late for sorry," the man said, his voice so cold that it seemed to freeze the very air around her. "You can't change it now. You can't bring me back." Kayla's heart twisted in her chest. She could feel the weight of his words, the truth they carried. She had failed him. She had left him to die, and now she had to live with the consequences. The darkness around her seemed to close in tighter, swallowing her whole. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could feel was the suffocating grip of her own guilt, wrapping itself around her like a noose. There was no escape. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but the words felt like ashes in her mouth. "I never meant for any of this to happen." The man's face softened for a brief moment, but the expression quickly faded, replaced by the same cold emptiness. "You can't outrun it," he said, his voice now just a low, mournful whisper. "You can't escape the truth." Kayla's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She could hear his words echoing in her mind over and over, like a constant refrain. There was no escape, no way to undo the past, the crash, the screams, the decisions she had made. It was all a part of her now, and there was no going back. She felt herself sinking, falling deeper into the void, until the world around her seemed to collapse into nothingness. The man was gone, but his presence lingered, filling the empty space with the weight of everything she had lost. And then there was silence. As the darkness swallowed Kayla whole, she felt herself falling not into the void but into the very core of her own soul. The weight of her past actions, the guilt, the sorrow, all became one single crushing force. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat a painful reminder of the choices she had made. But even as she fell, something shifted. The suffocating darkness that had seemed so absolute began to recede. The weight in her chest lightened, just for a moment, as if a tiny spark of clarity had pierced through the fog. She had no idea where this feeling came from, but it was there, whispering to her, a strange sense of peace, however fleeting. "I can't undo it," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and raw. "But I can learn. I can carry this and live with it." The man's voice echoed one last time, but it wasn't cold. It was softer now, almost as if it was fading, being carried away on the wind. "You can never change what happened, Kayla, but you can choose how you live with it." And then all was silent. The oppressive darkness that had seemed so overwhelming just moments before was now gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. Kayla opened her eyes. The world was no longer a void, but a place of endless gray, a reflection of her own soul. She was standing alone, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel suffocated. The weight of the past still hung around her, yes, but she no longer felt like it would crush her. It was there, a reminder, but no longer her prison. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know how she would live with the burden she carried, or if she could ever forgive herself. But she knew one thing, she wasn't going to run anymore. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. As the gray faded into the pale light of dawn, Kayla took a deep breath. The world around her was silent, but for the first time, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like a beginning. And though she knew she could never change the past, she realized she still had the power to choose her future. She wasn't free of the guilt, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn to live with it. And that would have to be enough.